It was May 1890 when an old general stepped out of a carriage in front of a gathered crowd in the old capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Initially, he had not been invited. The organizers of the unveiling of Robert E. Lee's equestrian statue did not want this general in attendance, but when some of the general's former artillerymen insisted that he join the group of veterans of America's bloodiest war, the organizers relented. The general climbed the stairs and sat on the stage with other veterans of the Civil War, knowing that through his decisions, especially in the last few decades of his life, he was seen by some as a traitor to the Confederacy. The general was James Longstreet. He was known as Lee's old warhorse and Lee's bulldog during the war, and being commander of the 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, he should have been a natural choice to join other veterans on the day of the unveiling of Lee's statue, but his story is much more complicated. James Longstreet was born in South Carolina on January 8, 1821 to James and Mary Ann Dent Longstreet. Neither his father nor his mother were from the South Carolina-Georgia border region, where they owned a cotton plantation near the modern-day town of Gainesville. His father James was born in New Jersey. His mother was born in Maryland. His first Longstreet ancestor stepped foot on the North American continent in the Dutch colony of New Netherlands in 1657. His name was Dirk Stoffels Longstreet. The family stayed in that area until William, with the new anglicized last name of Longstreet, moved from their family home in New Jersey to Augusta, Georgia, bringing along the father of the Confederate general. William and his wife Hannah settled into life in the South, with William building a steamboat propelled not by a paddle wheel, but by a series of long poles driven by the engine against the river bottom. Because of its complexity, he couldn't get financial backers, but he remained in the South, eventually purchasing a cotton plantation in South Carolina, north of Augusta, Georgia. William would pass away in 1814, but his son James would continue the Longstreet tradition of roaming. James would move closer to the Appalachian Mountains and purchase land on which to grow cotton worked by slave labor. He would meet Mary Ann Dent on one of his trips to Augusta. She was a distant cousin to Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. Her parents moved from Maryland to Georgia in 1812. The two married in 1814. From that year until 1820, Mary had given birth to 4 children, 2 of them dying in infancy. After Christmas in 1820, Mary traveled to her mother-in-law's home in South Carolina, where she would give birth to their 5th child, James. Although he was born in South Carolina, James would always consider Georgia his home state. The young man would be nicknamed Pete or Peter by his family, and the name stuck, being used by family throughout his life. By the age of 9, his father wanted James to get an education so that he could get into West Point Military Academy. The young James read books about Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Napoleon, filling his head with military glory. To indulge his son's longing for a military career, the elder James sent his son to live with his aunt, uncle, and cousins in Augusta, Georgia, so he could attend the Richmond County Academy. His uncle, Augustus B. Longstreet, also attended the academy, but had been expelled. His uncle was an impressive figure, though. Having been reportedly 17 pounds at birth, he would attend Yale and graduate before attending Judge Tapping Reeves Law School in Litchfield, Connecticut. In 1815, Augustus would return to Augusta and be admitted to the bar. Later, he became a state legislator and a judge on the Superior Court. Living in a house with such a prolific individual must have been, at least at first, daunting to a 9-year-old. However, the family embraced James and treated him as one of the family. The son of Augustus and Frances Longstreet passed away from illness shortly before James arrived, and it can be assumed that James acted as a sort of replacement for the grieving father. The academy was a strict institution. The students remained in class from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. In the warmth of the spring and summer, they would report an hour earlier and stay an hour later. The only vacation would be 7 weeks between mid-August and early October. James and his roughly 300 classmates would learn mathematics, grammar, composition, Latin, Greek, and oratory skills. James did not like the discipline implemented by the academy. He had come from the freedom of open fields and exciting forests, where his muscles meant more than his intellect. He never seemed to adapt to his new lifestyle, and his grades reflected that. James longed each day to get back to his uncle's plantation called Westover. In the late 1820s and 1830s, debate over tariffs and the tariff of abominations termed by South Carolina brought with it ideas of nullification. One of the leaders of the nullification movement was John C. Calhoun, a friend of Augustus Longstreet. Both men attended Yale and Judge Reeves' school, and both men supported states' rights. Augustus's home became a meeting place for Georgia's states' rights activists, and undoubtedly young James heard the arguments and saw his uncle's passion. Eventually, the nullification fervor dissipated, but never completely went away. In 1833, James was hit with a tragedy. His father died during a cholera outbreak, and his mother wouldn't remain at the home in northeast Georgia. She decided to move to northern Alabama. The long distance discouraged James from visiting his mother during his 7 weeks vacation each year, so his Uncle Augustus and Aunt Frances became like parents to him. He would remain with them until 1838, when Augustus attempted to get James an appointment to the West Point Military Academy. Unfortunately, the position from Augustus' district had been filled already, but Augustus used some of his political connections, and along with help from John C. Calhoun, they got Representative Reuben Chapman from Alabama, who represented the district in which Mary Longstreet lived, to nominate James for the military academy. He entered West Point in July 1838, nearly standing his adult height of 6 feet 2 inches. He was an impressive figure. Over 80 cadets would join him, but over the next 4 years, those numbers would be whittled away through academic rigors of the academy. 17 of those cadets would go on to become Civil War generals, including William S. Rosecrans, Earl Van Dorn, Daniel Harvey Hill, Abner Doubleday, George Sykes, Lafayette McLaws, and Alexander P. Stewart, to name a few. From July to September, Longstreet endured the summer encampment and the exams that followed, so that he officially started the academic year in September. The cadets during the encampment would sleep in wall tents, drill, and in general, get a feel for what awaited them in the following months. The new round of cadets brought civilians from the region, and young ladies would attend the ball that concluded each week. When the academic year began in 1838, it brought with it a new superintendent, Major Richard Delafield. Because of his strictness and his sarcasm, James and the other cadets nicknamed him Dickie the Punster. However, Delafield did a good job of improving the curriculum for the cadets by introducing improved cavalry instructions and would secure a battery of light artillery on which the cadets could train. The next 4 years would be some of the most difficult to date for the young Georgian, who already despised the schooling he had endured in Augusta. Despite his longing to enter the military, James Longstreet did not excel at the assignments. It was similar to his time at the Richmond County Academy, where while he was in class, he longed to be outside and away from the strictness and the academics. Longstreet gravitated toward outdoor activities and those classes that required physical activity, like infantry tactics, horsemanship, and sword exercises. He was ready to participate in any roughhousing or sports played by the cadets, and because of his size, he held his own in those situations. However, his academics were lacking. Throughout all 4 years at West Point, Longstreet ranked in the bottom third of his class in every subject. In his second year, he ranked 60th out of 61 cadets in chemistry. He didn't fare much better in the other subjects either. He failed a January examination in mechanics because he did not see the sense in pulleys. He would retake the test and pass. Longstreet accumulated a great many demerits or infractions while at West Point, ranging from keeping a dirty room to long hair to disobeying orders. During his 3rd year, he accumulated 164 demerits, ranking him 211th out of 219 cadets in conduct. His friends would call him Old Pete, a continuation of what his family nicknamed him. According to his second wife, he was voted most handsome in his class. He easily made friends because of his willingness to buck the rules in name of fun. George Thomas, an upperclassman, befriended Longstreet for 2 years before graduating. He also befriended William S. Rosecrans, John Pope, Alexander Stewart, Harvey Hill, and Lafayette McLaws, all future Civil War generals, including some he would command and some he would fight against at various points. Although he made friends with cadets in his own class, he formed a lasting friendship with a lower classman named Ulysses S. Grant, or as Longstreet would call him, Sam. In this friendship, opposites definitely attracted. Grant was by all accounts a serious and reserved young man, while Longstreet was much more carefree. Longstreet described him as of noble, generous heart, a lovable character, a valued friend. His academic record shows a poor student, but despite his lack of interest in mathematics and engineering, he passed nonetheless. He would graduate in 1842, 54th out of 56 cadets. He was 21 years old and now a brevet second lieutenant in the infantry. Before taking his first official assignment, James would visit his aunt and uncle in Georgia, then proceed to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, being part of the 4th United States Infantry. His commander at the barracks was Lieutenant Colonel John Garland. His company commander was Captain Bradford Alden. Both men would teach him the responsibility of an Army officer. After a year of service at the barracks, James's friend Ulysses S. Grant was assigned to the barracks and the 4th Infantry. The two would spend a lot of time together, especially any downtime from Army duties. The two lieutenants made friends with another officer, Frederick T. Dent, whose family lived not far from the barracks. They visited the Dent home, Whitehaven, often, especially since Longstreet's mother was a cousin to the Dents. On February 1844, that is where Ulysses S. Grant met Julia Dent. Afterward, Grant would make trips to Whitehaven without Longstreet. However, just a few months later, Longstreet began courting Maria Louisa Garland. Called Louise by her family, she was the daughter of Longstreet's regimental commander John Garland. Quickly, the young lieutenant asked Louise's parents for permission to marry her, but they insisted that they wait until she was a little bit older. She was 17 and Longstreet was 23. The two's courtship was put on hold when in May 1844, the 4th and 3rd Infantry Regiments were ordered from Jefferson Barracks to Louisiana to be part of the Army of Observation under Major General Zachary Taylor because of the tension between Mexico and the United States over the annexation of Texas. It was at Camp Salubrity that Longstreet developed a passion for poker, which he could play from dawn till dusk. It was also in Louisiana that he was officially promoted to 2nd Lieutenant on March 4, 1845, but this also came with a transfer to the 8th United States Infantry. That unit was stationed at St. Augustine, Florida, where Longstreet would arrive in early April. In August, he sat on a court-martial in Pensacola, but just a month later the regiment was transferred to Zachary Taylor's Army of Occupation at Corpus Christi, Texas. Grant and Longstreet would come back together and take part in hunting wolves, deer, and even mountain lions in their off-duty hours, along with playing lots of poker. Longstreet described Grant as a poor poker player who would only join in low-stake games. During the winter of 1845 to 1846, the officers in Zachary Taylor's army, under the direction of Captain John B. Magruder, constructed an 800-seat theater to perform famous plays. The theater would be packed with rank-and-file soldiers, eagerly awaiting to see their officers perform on stage. The officers would play both the male and female roles. After Longstreet was rejected for the role of Desdemona, Ulysses S. Grant got the important role. The officers charged admission and received enough money to pay for the construction of the theater. In March 1846, Taylor's army marched to the Rio Grande and constructed Fort Texas, opposite the Mexican city of Matamoros. When Taylor marched many of his troops to Port Isabel for supplies, the Mexican army crossed the Rio Grande and attempted to get between Taylor and Fort Texas. At the Battle of Palo Alto, Longstreet's regiment formed on the left of the American line and helped outflank the Mexican right flank. The next day, on May 9th, at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, Taylor caught up to the Mexican army, and the 8th United States Infantry, along with Longstreet, were integral in the capture of the Mexican artillery pieces and resisting the Mexican cavalry charges. After the engagement on May 9th, Taylor marched over the Rio Grande and captured and abandoned Matamoros. At that town, Taylor assembled supplies and men for an invasion of Mexico. The Mexican army opposing him had retreated around 100 miles deeper into Mexican territory. By September 20th, the American army came in sight of the fortified town of Monterey. From September 21st to the 24th, the American army battled for control of the town. Longstreet and the 8th Infantry was in William Worth's division, which was tasked with attacking the town from the west. On the approach, Longstreet led a skirmish line from the 8th behind a line of Texas Rangers. When Mexican cavalry pushed back the Rangers, it was Longstreet's men that swept the Mexicans aside and moved toward the town. During the battle, he could be found at the head of his men leading them into battle, capturing Independence Hill and Fort Libertad. At one point breaking out into hand-to-hand combat, which he used his large size to overpower opponents. Finally, the Mexican army was pushed into the town, and the Americans worked from house to house in urban warfare. The battle demonstrated Longstreet's aggressiveness and ability to lead men in combat. For his actions, he was promoted to adjutant of the regiment, and a few months later promoted to first lieutenant. The American army occupied the town of Monterey, but by November, they marched to Saltillo, where Taylor was ordered to remain. General Winfield Scott was planning an invasion of Mexico through Veracruz and needed as many troops as possible from Taylor's army. Worth's division, including Longstreet and the 8th Infantry, were dispatched to Scott's army, and on March 9, 1847, launched an amphibious assault on Veracruz. It would be captured by American forces, but a much bigger obstacle laid in the Americans' way. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led an army north to confront Taylor but was defeated at the Battle of Buena Vista. Now that Scott had made landfall, Santa Anna marched to stop Scott's invasion of Mexico. Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and last time I talked about Longstreet, he was headed to Veracruz to join Winfield Scott's army on his push to capture Mexico City. Once on Mexican soil, General Winfield Scott pushed westward. Longstreet's regiment mostly stayed in reserve and spent 3 months near Puebla, waiting on reinforcements with the rest of the army until August. Finally, Scott made it to the outskirts of Mexico City, but Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna possessed around 30,000 troops to defend the capital. Scott's army numbered around 11,000. It would be at the fight near Churubusco that Longstreet would see the most action during this campaign, when he and his regiment were to attack the fortifications guarding a bridge on the Churubusco River. When other regiments in his brigade got stalled by musketry and artillery, he and the captain of Company H of the 8th Infantry charged the position, with Longstreet bearing the flag of the regiment. He scrambled up the 15-foot walls of the fortifications, his comrades standing on the shoulders of others to escape the ditch in front of the Mexican position. When the Americans entered the fort, the Mexican defenders began to flee, and the Americans took the bridge. Longstreet would be brevetted captain for his gallant and meritorious conduct at Churubusco. After that American victory, Santa Anna requested an armistice, which was granted. Santa Anna used the lull in the fight to strengthen his lines and pull them back closer to the city. On September 6, the truce ended. The next assignment for the 8th and the other units to assault Casamata was a diversion against the main assault against Molino del Rey. The attack columns in which Longstreet was a part took heavy losses, with 27 killed and 132 wounded, without taking Casamata. However, the main attack worked, and the Mexican army pulled out of Casamata. For his performance, Longstreet would be breveted to a major. 5 days later, the army would attack Chapultepec, the military academy of the city. Longstreet's regiment was held in reserve until the American attacking force got stalled, and the reserve was called up to engage the enemy. In front of the regiment, carrying its flag, was Longstreet, who received a bullet wound in his thigh. He staggered and fell, handing the flag to Lieutenant George Pickett, who carried it over the wall. Mexico City was captured on September 14th, and now the American army occupied the capital. His wound prevented him from indulging in Mexican society as much as the other soldiers, because the bullet wound was slow to heal. He stayed in the home of a wealthy Mexican family, and by December 10th, he was able to travel back to the United States. Longstreet would stay 2 months with his mother in Huntsville, Alabama, before heading to Lynchburg, Virginia. Throughout the Mexican War, Longstreet kept a picture of Louise with him. Her and her family stayed with relatives in Lynchburg, while her father fought in Mexico. When Longstreet returned to Louise, her family agreed that she was old enough to wed. They wasted no time, and within a few days, the ceremony was planned and took place. They married on March 8, 1848, at the home of Louise's uncle, Judge James Garland, on Madison Street. Among his groomsmen were Captain Joseph Selden and future Confederate general in the Army of Northern Virginia, Lieutenant Edward Johnson. The honeymoon took place en route to Longstreet's next assignment, recruiting duty in Poughkeepsie, New York. He would stay there until July, when he found out that the 8th Infantry were coming back from Mexico, and he requested to be transferred back to the regiment. In August, he and Louise traveled to Missouri to attend the wedding of Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Dent. Then they proceeded to Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. It would be at the barracks that Louise would give birth to their first child, John Garland Longstreet, on December 26, 1848. He was named after his grandfather on his mother's side, and be the first of 10 children born to the couple. Longstreet thought he could manage children like soldiers, but quickly found that children did not behave as soldiers, and he turned the parenting duties over to Louise, who was much better at managing them. In May 1849, Longstreet would rejoin his regiment at San Antonio, Texas, a small town with about 1,000 people. In January 1850, Louise would get a welcome surprise when her father was named commander of the 8th and stationed in San Antonio. Louise's mother came with John, and it was a family reunion. Duty on the Texas frontier consisted mostly of protecting immigrants and residents of the state from Native American attacks. When Longstreet became the chief of commissary for the department, his days were filled with paperwork, so he did not take part in much fighting. However, he did learn about the administrative duties of an army by working to supply his soldiers with adequate food, weapons, ammunition, and mounts. He was only in that position for 6 months when he requested a transfer to the cavalry, believing he could rise above his lieutenant rank faster in that branch of service. As a lieutenant, he was making just $40 a month. He would be denied the transfer. He most likely wanted the raise in pay because Louise was pregnant with another child and would give birth on December 15, 1850 to another son, Augustus Baldwin Longstreet. On March 9, 1851, he resigned his commissary position and returned to the 8th Infantry, where he took part in patrols in Comanche territory. Finally, on December 7, 1852, he was promoted to captain, and just 4 months later, Louise gave birth to William Dent Longstreet on April 19, 1853. In early 1854, Longstreet was sent east to deliver a message, and his family came with him. They traveled by ship to New York City, then to Washington, D.C., where their 1-year-old son, William, passed away. They then proceeded to Fort Bliss, Texas by July. He would take command of Company K of the 8th Regiment, relieving Lieutenant George Pickett, who was acting as commander in the absence of a captain. Pickett and Longstreet developed a good friendship while in Texas, and when Pickett was transferred to the Washington Territory in June 1855, it was hard for Longstreet to see Pickett go. In January 1855, Longstreet's company and another company pursued the Mescaleros Apaches to the Guadalupe Mountains. Along the way, the Apaches killed Longstreet's civilian guide, but the soldiers could not bring the Apaches to battle. Along the way, they met some cavalry, led by Jeb Stuart, also in pursuit of Apaches. They traded information about their enemy, but then returned to their respective posts. Fort Bliss was a happy place for the Longstreets. Its closeness to El Paso allowed for a vibrant social life. The officers and men mingled freely, and the officers' families added to the wholesomeness of the post. Louise thoroughly enjoyed it there because it was under the departmental command of her father, and he and her mother would come visit them often at Fort Bliss. Longstreet and Louise would stay at Fort Bliss for 4 years total. While there, their 4th child, Harriet Margaret Longstreet, was born, but she only lived 5 months. In July 1857, she gave birth to their 5th child, a son named James Longstreet. The means for education were sparse at Fort Bliss, and he wanted his 2 oldest sons, who were now school-age, to get an education. So in March 1858, he asked for a transfer east so that he could get his children set up in school. They gave him a 6-month leave, and he and the family would travel to visit his aunt and uncle in Columbia, South Carolina, where Augustus was the president of the College of South Carolina. Then they went to Yonkers, New York, to enroll his 2 oldest sons in a boys' school. While on the journey, Longstreet learned that he was promoted to major and took on the role of paymaster. His next assignment would be Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. While traveling to take his place at Fort Leavenworth, he stopped over in St. Louis and found some old Army buddies. They sat and reminisced and started up a game of brag, but they needed another player, so one of the men left and returned with Ulysses S. Grant. By this point, Grant had been out of the Army for years and was a struggling farmer outside the city. When the game ended, Grant and Longstreet stepped outside, where Grant handed his friend a $5 gold piece. Longstreet had loaned him $5 when they were at West Point, and Grant wanted to repay his debt. Longstreet refused to take it, but Grant insisted, saying, "You must take it. I cannot live with anything in my possession which is not mine." Longstreet begrudgingly accepted it, and then departed for Fort Leavenworth. At Fort Leavenworth, Longstreet performed the regular duties of a paymaster, traveling throughout the department issuing payment to officers and men alike, but he would not stay in that department more than a year. In October 1859, Longstreet was transferred to his father-in-law's department in New Mexico, headquartered at Albuquerque. This brought a reunion for Louise and her mother and father, but that didn't last long. Her mother fell ill shortly after their arrival, and her father took her mother to Saratoga, New York, to the mineral springs to help her heal. It was there she collapsed and then died on August 30th, 1860. Louise's father would live another year before passing away. It was in New Mexico that Longstreet received the sporadic news about the contentious 1860 election between Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, John Bell, and John C. Breckinridge. Longstreet would go on to call that winter a time of painful suspense, as he and the other officers waited for any news about the country and the result of the election. Abraham Lincoln won the election, and with his election, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Longstreet heard about South Carolina's decision and within a few days made his own decision. It appeared the rest of the South would leave as well, and he made preparations to join it. Although his decision was quick, the decision-making process was not easy for him. He did not believe in secession. However, the states' rights doctrine had been instilled in him at a young age by his uncle Augustus. One of his biographers suggests that the reason he chose to join the South was his love for his uncle, who was a father to him, and he felt that rejecting the South meant rejecting his father figure. Plus, he was a Southerner. All of these factors most likely helped in his decision to side with the Confederacy. Also in December, seeing the tensions arise, he requested from the War Department that an escort be provided for him to take his family from Albuquerque through Indian Territory to San Antonio, Texas. His wife was in the last few weeks of her pregnancy, and without an escort, the family would be in too much danger traveling alone. The War Department rejected his request. Louise would give birth to Mary Ann Longstreet on December 31st, 1860. While all of this went on, Longstreet made preparations for his role in what would most likely become a war. He wrote to a friend and congressman from Alabama, telling him to tender his services to the governor of the state if Alabama seceded. He most likely chose Alabama because of three factors. 1, his mother still lived there. 2, one of Alabama's congressional districts appointed him to West Point. And 3, because of that appointment, he was the senior officer in the Army from that state, and that means he would be given a military rank commensurate in the state forces. He heard nothing from his congressional friend and decided to write to the governor personally on February 15, 1861, saying in the letter that he assumed Alabama had seceded, which it had. Word had not reached Albuquerque about its secession. He wrote, "I desire therefore to tender through you my services to her, should she need a soldier who has seen hard service. I am the senior officer of the Army from Alabama, and should be the first to offer her such assistance in my profession as I may be able to render." What Longstreet did not know was that his congressional friend had already passed his letter off to the governor, and the governor had already endorsed it. He had sent it and the newest letter to the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and the Confederate Secretary of War. 7 prominent men of Montgomery also vouched for Longstreet, saying, "He is an officer of high character, of chivalric bearing, of unquestioned loyalty, patriotism, and courage." By early April, he was prepared to resign his commission and leave for Alabama, but 2 paymasters in the Army resigned their commission before him. Longstreet's superior, Colonel William W. Loring, asked Longstreet to assume their duties and close their accounts. Longstreet did as he was ordered. By the end of April, word came to Longstreet about the firing on Fort Sumter, and he resigned his commission on May 9, 1861. A government auditor found that Longstreet was in debt $116.60, of which Longstreet immediately took care of, stating, "I would rather have my right hand cut off than leave the service owing a cent." Interestingly, Longstreet accepted his commission in the Confederate Army on May 1st, 8 days before he resigned his commission in the United States Army. The Confederate government made him a lieutenant colonel to rank from March 16th. The commission was accompanied by a voucher for $306 as payment for the period of May 1st to June 24th, meaning that Longstreet, while a soldier in the United States Army, was also a soldier in the Confederate Army and receiving payments for his Confederate service. In a United States Army ambulance, Longstreet and his family bumped along eastward through the American Southwest. At Fort Fillmore, he met up with some old Army comrades, and they discussed the war and its future. He was asked how long he thought the war would last. Longstreet said he believed it would last 3 years. From there, himself, Louise, and the children traveled to San Antonio. It was there Longstreet left his family to proceed to Richmond. He hated to leave them behind, but he felt he needed to get to Richmond as quickly as possible. On the San Antonio-San Diego stage line, he rode with the stage line superintendent George H. Giddings, who had accompanied Longstreet on a patrol years ago when they were tracking Native American raiders. During a melee, Longstreet's horse was shot and the animal pinned down the officer. Giddings protected Longstreet until the officer could extricate himself. From there, they traveled to Galveston to get on a ship bound for Louisiana. While on the ship, he met Thomas Jewett Gorey. Gorey was from Alabama and was traveling to offer his services to the Confederate Army. Longstreet and Gorey immediately began a friendship and traveled together. They made their way to New Orleans, then took a train through Mississippi and Alabama to Chattanooga, Tennessee. From there, they got on a train on the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad and traveled through the Unionist sympathizing region of East Tennessee, then to Richmond. Gorey remarked that the East Tennesseans looked sour, mean, and glum. On June 21st, Longstreet, Gorey, and the other men he met in Texas made it to Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Since placing the capital there from its original home in Montgomery, Alabama, the Virginia city had been inundated with bureaucrats, merchants, contractors, and men seeking to fight in the upcoming war. Upon arrival, Longstreet and the Texans met with Jefferson Davis, who informed the lieutenant colonel that he had been promoted to brigadier general on June 17th. Longstreet would formally accept it on June 25th. Within days of his arrival at Richmond, Longstreet would travel north to Manassas Junction, where Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard had his army defending one of the most critical points in the Confederacy, guarding the Confederate capital. Joseph E. Johnston's army in the Shenandoah Valley lay not too far away and could come at a quick notice to Beauregard's assistance if needed. On July 6, Longstreet assumed command of 3 Virginia regiments, the 1st, 11th, and 17th Virginia Infantry Regiments. Unlike many of the units in this new army, Virginia's units had a foundation of military training because of the state's militia system, so Longstreet got the privilege of commanding some of the better trained troops in the army at this stage of the war. He immediately ordered his 3 regiments to drill 3 times a day in anticipation of an impending battle. Gorey, the young man whom Longstreet met on his travel from Texas to Louisiana and who continued to accompany him to Richmond, became a volunteer aide to the new general with the unofficial rank of captain. One of Longstreet's biographers explained his selection of his staff members. Gorey typified the caliber of young men whom Longstreet would select for his staff. The general was an excellent judge of talent, seeking individuals of intelligence and perception who had organizational skills. He sought neither sycophants nor fools. Men of keener intelligence than himself did not threaten Longstreet. Confidence in his own abilities allowed him to fashion a personal staff that became one of the finest, if not the finest, in the Army during 1862 and 1863. A young Alabamian residing in Mississippi when the war broke out joined his staff as well. His name was Peyton T. Manning, and he graduated from Georgia Military Institute in 1859. The small, thin man was intelligent, and as one observer said, had a quick, clear mind. Another man that joined his staff was also from Alabama, but was residing in Mississippi when the war broke out as well. His name was Thomas Walton. He had been a lawyer before the war and attracted Longstreet's attention when he arrived in Virginia. Walton possessed an explosive temper that he could easily unleash on anyone who crossed him. Dr. Dorsey Cullen also joined Longstreet's staff as the brigade's medical director. Beauregard assigned Frank Armistead to Longstreet's staff when he arrived at Manassas Junction, but he would leave the group by the end of the summer. As the Union Army lurched toward the Confederate Army at Manassas, Beauregard began deploying his troops at vital locations. Some of those areas of importance were the fords across Bull Run, and the commanding general assigned Longstreet's brigade the duty of holding Blackburn's Ford. At a little before 11 a.m. on July 18th, Longstreet, perched atop his horse, could see the Union soldiers maneuvering toward his position as he looked through a pair of opera glasses that he borrowed from a member of Beauregard's staff. At 11, the silence broke with artillery blasts from the Union guns opposite Longstreet's position. The general jumped off his horse, dropping the opera glasses and losing them, disappointing the staffer who had purchased them years earlier in Paris, France. Some Massachusetts soldiers approached Longstreet's men, and the two sides fired volleys at one another. The first taste of combat rattled many young men in the brigade, and some began to flee. Longstreet, with a cigar in one hand and a sword in the other, rallied as many men as possible and sent the Federal troops back across the ford. After the small attack by a few companies of Bay Staters, Colonel Israel Richardson's entire brigade made repeated attacks against Longstreet's 3 regiments. As the battle ebbed and flowed, Virginians began to scamper to the rear, either overcome with fear or doing so under the guise of helping a comrade to safety. Longstreet had no choice but to request reinforcements from Beauregard, who dispatched Jubal Early's 3-regiment brigade and 7 artillery pieces from the Washington Artillery to Longstreet's aid. Longstreet later recalled that Beauregard might have been irritated around that time because a Union artillery shell struck the kitchen of the McLean home and disrupted his meal. When one of Early's regiments arrived, they lined up behind Longstreet and his brigade higher on the hill but at the same height as Longstreet. As the general attempted to get out of the way of the men preparing to fire, he dove from his horse to the ground to avoid being shot and laid there until the men fired their volley. Somehow his horse was unscathed. With the increased firepower of Early's regiment, the Union line began to buckle, and Longstreet raced to the front of his line and ordered a counterattack, which only a few companies heard, but that was enough to send the Union brigade out of the rifle range of Longstreet's men. The Confederates returned to their former positions as both sides' artillery pieces dueled until darkness covered the battlefield. During the night, Early's brigade relieved Longstreet's men and took their place, with Longstreet's brigade going to a stand of pines to rest and regroup. Beauregard would say of Longstreet's actions, "By his presence at the right place at the right moment among his men, by the exhibition of characteristic coolness, and by his words of encouragement to the men of his command, he infused a confidence and spirit that contributed largely to the success of our arms on that day." Longstreet suffered 68 casualties and collected accolades from many other commanders and men who saw his actions on the field. Between the fight on July 18th and the resumption of the fighting on July 21st, Joseph E. Johnston's army in the Shenandoah Valley arrived at Manassas Junction to reinforce Beauregard. Johnston and Beauregard convened to construct a battle plan, and it was decided for the Confederate left to outflank the Union right, but what they didn't know was that the Union commander, Irvin McDowell, was proposing a similar strategy to use his right flank to outflank the Confederate left. So, on July 21st, the Union right and Confederate left met on Matthews Hill and Henry House Hill and battled it out, while the right of the Confederate line that was supposed to advance stalled because Richard Ewell's brigade on the far right never got the orders to advance. Longstreet's and some of the other brigades moved anyway, but fell back to their positions across Bull Run. Between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m., a courier from Johnston ordered Longstreet to form his brigade and link up with Brigadier General Millage Bonham's brigade to his left and pursue the retreating Federals, who were running toward Washington, D.C. Longstreet and Bonham's brigades advanced a short distance, but an artillery battery stood in their way. The Union battery fired shells over the heads of the Confederates, but posed little danger. Bonham, who outranked Longstreet, lost his nerve and ordered a retreat. Longstreet and two of his aides, Frank Terry and Thomas Lubbock, two of the Texans Longstreet had met along with Gorey on their travels to Richmond, went ahead and scouted the position and found a way to capture the guns. Longstreet was enraged at the order to retreat. He rode to Bonham and asked permission to charge the battery, but Bonham said, "We must go back, that a glorious victory might not be turned into a terrible disaster." Longstreet insisted that he could capture the battery without the loss of a single man, reach Centerville, and pursue all the way to Washington, but Bonham would not change his mind. Soon a courier from Johnston arrived telling them that the Confederate right flank was being turned and to retreat. Now Longstreet bristled with rage. He said that the Union army was running for their lives, that the intelligence that their flank was being turned was absurd. Longstreet threw his hat on the ground and threw many choice words in the general direction of anyone around him. He said, "Retreat! The Federal army has broken to pieces." Nevertheless, Longstreet halted his command, but it took hours for him to cool off. A gentleman who was new to Longstreet's staff, arriving that morning, got to see Longstreet's anger firsthand. The young man's name was Moxley Sorrell. He was a 23-year-old South Carolinian with a temper of his own, and had been a bank clerk in Savannah before the war, but he would become one of the most trusted members of Longstreet's staff. He had arrived that morning, sent to Longstreet from Beauregard, because the Brigadier General had asked for additional staff. Sorrell described his new commander as a most striking figure, about 40 years of age, a soldier every inch, and very handsome, tall and well-proportioned, strong and active, a superb horseman, and with an unsurpassed soldierly bearing, his features and expression fairly matched. Eye glint blue steel, deep and piercing, a full brown beard, head well-shaped and poised. The worst feature was the mouth, rather coarse. It was partly hidden, however, by his ample beard. After the battle, sickness plagued the army. Officers and men alike did not know how to properly dispose of sewage, and this led to typhoid fever and other illnesses, taking many of the young men's lives. Longstreet did not avoid the sickness. The last week of July, he was confined to a sick bed, but in less than a week resumed command of his brigade. The brigade expanded to 4 Virginia regiments. It kept the foundation of the 1st, 11th, and 17th, but it would acquire the 7th Virginia Infantry during the Army's reorganization after the battle. Colonel James Kemper commanded that regiment. He was a Mexican War veteran and a member of the Virginia legislature. During the first week in August, Longstreet's brigade participated in a grand review that Beauregard organized for Prince Jerome Napoleon, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and a cousin of Napoleon III. After that, Longstreet and his brigade, along with the others from the army, advanced on Fairfax Courthouse to block any possible advance by the Union Army from Washington, D.C. By late August, Longstreet would at one point possess authority over 7 brigades near Fairfax Courthouse. To always keep fresh troops at the front, he instituted a series of company rotations so that his troops would not remain in danger for long periods of time. Longstreet even advanced his men to capture Mason's Hill and Munson's Hill, which allowed soldiers to count window panes in Washington, D.C. They were so close. Also in August, Longstreet got another member of his staff, John W. Fairfax, one of the wealthiest individuals in Northern Virginia. Although he opposed secession, when his state left the Union, he offered his services to the Confederate Army as a staff officer. Moxley Sorrell stated that Fairfax lacked nothing in courage, was brave, and would go anywhere, but Fairfax had 2 distinctions. He was the most pious churchman and was a born bon vivant. Wherever Fairfax went, he carried his Bible, an ample supply of liquor, and a bathtub in the shape of a tin hat. Each morning, when duty permitted, Fairfax bathed in the tub, reading his Bible and nipping a bottle of whiskey before breakfast. He kept the book and the bottle in a sock that seemingly never left his presence. Captain Gorey wrote to his mother about Longstreet saying, "General Longstreet is one of the kindest, best-hearted men I ever knew. Those not well acquainted with him think him short and crabbed, and he does appear so except in 3 places. First, when he's in the presence of ladies, second, at the table, and third, on the field of battle. At any of those places he has a complacent smile on his countenance, and seems to be one of the happiest men in the world." Longstreet enjoyed the close proximity of old army buddies that he now had in the Confederate Army. Fairfax's ability to acquire whiskey and Longstreet's love of poker brought many officers into Longstreet's headquarters. Jubal Early would often attend these festivities. One officer whom Longstreet had met before the war, but impressed him tremendously as the war began, was Colonel Jeb Stuart. Because Longstreet occupied the front of the Confederate Army, he had to work continuously with the cavalry led by Stuart, who communicated with Longstreet daily, informing him of enemy movements. Both Longstreet and Stuart were fond of a good story or joke, which drew the 2 men closer together. Longstreet would write of Stuart that he has been most untiring in the discharge of his duties at that and other advanced positions. He concluded by saying, "Colonel Stuart has, I think, fairly won his claim to brigadier, and I hope that the commanding general will unite with me in recommending him to that position." Joseph E. Johnston believed that Stuart unnecessarily endangered the artillery of his command after endorsing Longstreet's recommendation to promote Stuart. Longstreet jumped to defend the young Virginian and insisted to Beauregard that he had the right man in the right place. Afterward, Longstreet wrote to Stuart the following letter: "Yet you should remember that when there is so much at stake, the authorities are of the opinion that too much caution cannot be had. Besides, politics are a little mixed with our cause and actions, so we cannot be too guarded. Don't give yourself any uneasiness about the matter, however, for you have been entirely successful. Rest assured that so long as I can help you, you shall not be depreciated." On September 24th, Stuart would be promoted to brigadier general. Both Beauregard and Johnston admired Longstreet for his abilities and his tenacity, as well as his friendship. Both Beauregard and Johnston thought of him as a friend, Beauregard even wrote to the Confederate War Department asking if Longstreet could be put second in command. Longstreet and Thomas Stonewall Jackson were regarded as the 2 finest brigadiers in the Army by that point, and both men were put forward as candidates to become major generals. On October 13th, both men were confirmed in that rank, but not before Longstreet offered to resign after hearing that other brigadiers were promoted over himself. Beauregard soothed Longstreet's feelings and refused to accept the resignation. Upon being made Major General, Longstreet was given command of the 3rd Division of the Confederate Army of the Potomac. With the Army reorganization, Longstreet and the rest of the Army settled into winter quarters near Centerville. Longstreet's headquarters became a place of socialization. Many of the top generals in the Army gathered there to have a fine meal, a drink, and to socialize. After a party early in December, Longstreet and Johnston left arm in arm after imbibing in alcoholic beverages at the party. His relationship with both Beauregard and especially Johnston put him on the anti-administration side of the internal war between President Jefferson Davis and his two generals, Beauregard and Johnston. Disagreements between the generals and the President's orders, as well as the questions of rank within the Confederate Army, drove these divisions, and Longstreet would oppose Davis's administration in these fights. Despite his stance in January 1862, he was chosen as the emissary to travel to Richmond and meet with the President to discuss the upcoming expiring enlistments and the possibility of a draft. He spent a week in the capital attending the meetings. Only one good thing came out of his visit to Richmond. He got to spend time with Louise and the children, who boarded with friends in the capital. When the week ended, Longstreet returned to Johnston with little encouragement that the administration would help the military situation. Soon after rejoining the army, Longstreet got a telegram from Louise stating that scarlet fever had struck the family hard and the 4 children had it. He quickly returned to the capital to check on his family. On January 25th, 1-year-old Mary Ann died. The next day, 4-year-old James died. On February 1st, Augustus passed away, leaving only 13-year-old Garland. George Pickett and his soon-to-be wife, Sally Corbell, were with the Longstreets during the entire ordeal. Sally and George made the funeral arrangements, but James and Louise did not attend the ceremony because they could not bring themselves to see their children laid to rest. Longstreet quickly returned to Army life but raced back to Richmond when Garland took a turn for the worse and was nearing death. However, the teenager would recover. When Longstreet returned to the Army, he was changed by the experiences of the last few weeks. He turned more toward the church and gave up gambling. Word got to Johnston that the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, George McClellan, was preparing to move his 100,000-man army out of Washington, D.C. But what was Johnston to do against a numerically superior foe? He only possessed around 40,000 men. After a conference with the President, Johnston misunderstood Davis's position and began pulling his army toward Richmond. On March 5th, Jeb Stuart reported to Johnston that the Union Army was on the move south, so the Confederate Army commander began moving his troops along in 2 columns, marching down the Warrenton Turnpike and the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, hoping to take advantage of the high ground south of the Rappahannock River. Johnston moved his army behind that water barrier, while the Union Army occupied Centerville. Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee got word that Union Army transports and troops were massing around the peninsula in Virginia near Fort Monroe. Lee asked Johnston and Major General Gustavus W. Smith to examine the fortifications of John B. Magruder to defend the peninsula. In the absence of those 2 generals, Longstreet assumed Army command, being the senior commander. He would hold that role for 5 days. During those 5 days, Longstreet stated in his memoirs that he proposed to Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley a meeting of the 2 forces to assail Jackson's opponent Nathaniel Banks. In his memoirs, he wrote that he hoped that his army could return to their position before Johnston and Smith returned. However, no evidence of that discussion exists in the records, only Longstreet's telling of the story. Jackson wrote to Longstreet on April 3rd and then 2 days later, but he makes no mention of such a movement and only asks for reinforcements. Maybe Jackson thought Longstreet held no authority to act without Johnston or Davis's permission and declined the offer, but we may never know. When Johnston returned, Lee wrote to Johnston to start moving his force to Richmond. The Union Army was moving up the peninsula. Longstreet and his division moved by rail car to the capital. There, Longstreet would meet with the Secretary of War, the President, Lee, Smith, and Johnston to discuss the upcoming campaign. The meeting began at 11 a.m. on April 14th and lasted until 1 a.m. on April 15th, with only an hour break for dinner. Longstreet only made one comment, that he knew McClellan to be a trained engineer, and that his movements would be careful and most likely not take place before May 1st. With that, Davis interrupted him, and his part in the conversation ended. Longstreet then traveled to the fortifications on the peninsula where his division occupied the Confederate center. Johnston would order the trenches to be abandoned after brief skirmishing and an artillery bombardment, the Confederate Army using the growing darkness to shield their retreat on May 3rd. Moxley Sorrell informed Longstreet on the retreat that General Gabriel Rains, who had been experimenting with explosives, was planting artillery shells as landmines in the road to break up the approaching Federal columns. Longstreet wrote a stern note to Rains, ordering him to stop, that this went beyond legitimate warfare. On the withdrawal, Johnston directed Longstreet to preserve the Army wagons from being captured. At Williamsburg, with his headquarters on the campus of the College of William and Mary, he used 2 of his brigades to hold off the approaching Federal troops. When it appeared to those two brigades that they were going to be overrun, a courier dashed to Longstreet's headquarters to ask for reinforcements. He sent in Cadmus Wilcox's brigade and his own former brigade, now under Ambrose Powell Hill. The Confederates battled with Union forces around Fort Magruder, but Longstreet's division began to run low on ammunition. D.H. Hill's division arrived to relieve Longstreet's beleaguered troops, but it was a costly fight to protect the wagons. The army made it behind the Chickahominy River, 3 miles from the capital, and waited for the approaching enemy. However, an opportunity arose to land a decisive blow to the Union Army. McClellan had divided his forces. On May 28th, Johnston called together his division commanders. Smith suggested that they attack the right of the Union Army near Mechanicsville to prevent the linking up of Irvin McDowell's force approaching from Fredericksburg. However, during the discussion, a courier from Jeb Stuart arrived with information that McDowell was withdrawing, so the junction of the two Union armies would not materialize. Stonewall Jackson's defeat of Nathaniel Banks at Winchester had forced Lincoln to recall McDowell. With that information, Smith argued to attack the Union left at Seven Pines. During the arguments, Johnston walked away with Longstreet joining him. They conferred for a few moments and decided to wait to attack until Huger's division arrived from Petersburg. While they waited, D.H. Hill reconnoitered the ground towards Seven Pines and found that the Union Army had neglected to occupy a significant road to the south of that location. Johnston conferred with Longstreet about the battle plan. D.H. Hill's division would spearhead the operation, acting as the Confederate center. Longstreet's division extended Hill's left, and Benjamin Huger's division would occupy the right. Smith's division would be in support, and John Magruder's division would act as a reserve. They hoped to destroy the two isolated Union corps at Seven Pines. Longstreet remained with Johnston the whole time the commanding general organized the plan, but problems arose quickly. Johnston verbally told Longstreet his orders to command the entire front, including his own division, Hill's, and Huger's. It would be Longstreet's responsibility to implement the assault. He sent the other division commanders written orders. The attack was to begin at 8 a.m. on May 31st. However, Longstreet must have misunderstood the orders given to him by Johnston. When Smith's division, commanded by Brigadier General Whiting, moved to his supporting role, he found Longstreet's division entangling the road. Ultimately, instead of marching to the left of Hill's line, Longstreet formed behind Hill, dividing his brigades, sending some to the left, some to the right, and keeping some directly behind Hill. With this new change in battle formations through the mistake of Longstreet, it took the punching power away from the Confederate assault and made the Confederate battle line smaller. The battle began at 1 p.m., and the miscommunication led to poorly executed assaults. When Hill was able to coordinate his 4 brigades for an attack, he was able to push aside the Union soldiers, but the fight continued. Longstreet remained at his headquarters, accompanied by Jeb Stuart. When Hill asked for reinforcements, Longstreet obliged, sending in his brigades. Micah Jenkins led the South Carolinians in a grand assault, capturing 200 enemy troops. This only endeared Jenkins to Longstreet more. Before the battle, Longstreet described Jenkins as the best colonel in the army, and the Battle of Seven Pines confirmed it to Longstreet. By this point, neither Longstreet nor Johnston really left their headquarters. Johnston, knowing that problems were arising in the army, didn't investigate for himself, and Longstreet remained at his headquarters, content in sending in his brigades from afar. By midday, Johnston relocated his headquarters closer to the attack, where Lee met with him. The sounds of battle alerted them to the fighting happening to the south, and Johnston dispatched Smith's division to help on the Confederate right. As the day passed into night, Johnston ventured out onto the battlefield to get a better sense of the enemy's location when a burst of rifle fire erupted from the woods. A bullet ripped into the general's right shoulder, and seconds later, an artillery shell exploded above him, sending shrapnel into his chest, breaking a few ribs. When his staff got him back to headquarters, President Davis named Smith as commander of the army momentarily. The next day, Longstreet reported to Smith, and they talked about plans for the day. The Union launched their own assault, forcing the Confederates to fight. The two sides attacked and launched their own counter-assaults for the better part of 6 hours, and by 1 p.m., the Battle of Seven Pines ended. The Confederacy lost over 6,000, and the Union over 5,000. In Longstreet's report, he blamed Huger for not being in position as the reason for the attack failing, neglecting to mention his own misunderstandings. When Smith filed his report, he mentioned Longstreet's delays, but Johnston requested that he delete the remarks before handing them in, probably to defend himself as well as Longstreet. General Huger asked for a court of inquiry to clear his name, but neither Johnston nor Davis called for one, despite Davis promising Huger that he would when the time was right. On June 1st, about noon, Robert E. Lee rode to the headquarters of General Smith. President Davis had placed him in temporary command of the army until Johnston could return. On June 3rd, Robert E. Lee, the new commander of the Confederate Army guarding Richmond, called together his division commanders. At the meeting, some of the division commanders talked at length about what should be done to drive the Union Army of the Potomac away from the capital, but Longstreet sat silently, preferring to express his opinions to Lee in private. The meeting ended without Lee making any declarations as to what to do next. The next day, Longstreet was called to Lee's headquarters. In private, they discussed what Longstreet believed to be the best course of action, a strong attack against the Union right near Mechanicsville. After the meeting, Lee wrote to President Davis that Longstreet is a capital soldier. His recommendations hitherto have been good, and I have confidence in him. Lee's aides also saw that Longstreet was quickly becoming a close confidant of Lee. Lee placed all of his troops in readiness as he formulated a way to land a significant blow against the Union Army. On June 16th, he ordered Stonewall Jackson from the Shenandoah Valley. That same day, Longstreet arrived and suggested that Jackson be recalled from the valley. Lee confided in Longstreet that Stonewall was already on the way and outlined the plan of attack for Jackson to assault the isolated corps under Fitzjohn Porter to the north, while the rest of the army attacked the remaining enemy forces to the south. Longstreet and Lee worked to smooth out the plan, and it was decided to use the majority of the Confederate army to attack the isolated corps, while the rest held a defensive position to the south. On June 23rd, a dust-covered Jackson rode to Lee's headquarters, having rode around 60 miles on horseback to reach Lee. Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and D.H. Hill would join them. Lee then explained his plan and then excused himself, asking the division commanders to work out the details. Longstreet turned to Jackson and said because Stonewall's troops had the furthest to travel, he should set the time and date of the attack. Jackson stated June 25th at daylight. Longstreet made Jackson aware that felled trees and cavalry may block his path, so he may desire a further out date. So Jackson stated the 26th at daylight. Lee re-entered the room and was made aware of the time and date. The generals discussed the matter for a little longer, then Lee gave verbal orders to each man. Written orders would follow. Jackson was to turn Porter's flank, while A.P. Hill, once he heard of Jackson's arrival, would assault Mechanicsville and drive south, clearing the way for Longstreet and D.H. Hill's divisions. However, on the 26th, the divisions of A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, and Longstreet sat for the greater part of the day with no sign of Jackson. By 3 p.m., A.P. Hill, tired of waiting, attacked without Jackson. D.H. Hill and Longstreet would follow A.P. Hill's division, but do little fighting. The next morning, the attacks commenced again, with A.P. Hill driving forward to attack the Union position, but Longstreet arrived late to the site of the engagement. For over 2 hours, A.P. Hill's men assaulted the works of Fitzjohn Porter's corps. Finally, Longstreet arrived to relieve the pressure on Hill's men. The combined forces of the Confederate divisions of both Hill's, Longstreet, and Jackson broke the Union line at Gaines' Mill. Rest and maneuvering was done the next day. On June 30th, at Glendale, Longstreet would command both his and A.P. Hill's divisions against the Union Army. Artillery opened up the fight, with artillery shells coming dangerously close to President Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, who came closer to the front lines to observe the battle. A.P. Hill ordered the men to the rear. Longstreet sent in the brigades of Micah Jenkins, James Kemper, and Cadmus Wilcox initially. Many of the brigades lost half their strength against the entrenched Federals. Longstreet hesitated to send in both his and Hill's entire division because he was waiting on Jackson and Huger to make their own attacks. However, he couldn't wait any longer. The 3 brigades now engaged needed support, so he threw in Pickett's brigade and one of Hill's brigades. Soon, however, Longstreet called for all of Hill's division to charge into the fray. They turned the tide of the battle in favor of the Confederacy. Union General McCall was captured in the fighting, and as he was being brought to the rear, Longstreet removed his glove and extended his hand to McCall, whom he had served under in the 4th Infantry before the war. McCall refused his hand and said, "Excuse me, sir. I can stand defeat, but not insult." As the prisoner walked on, Longstreet got back to work. Lee and Longstreet and the rest of the divisions would give chase to the Federals again, but an opportunity had been lost that day. Longstreet and Hill engaged the enemy and fought hard, but Jackson and the other division commanders had not attacked as ordered. Lee met with Longstreet, Hill, and Magruder when a Federal surgeon found them. He had been left with the wounded at Willis Church, and Jackson had sent him to Lee for supplies and protection, which Lee granted. Before the doctor left, Longstreet inquired about Union troops in his front. The doctor replied that he had been in McCall's division and knew nothing of other units. Longstreet stated, "Well, McCall is safe in Richmond, but if his division had not offered the stubborn resistance it did on this road, we would have captured your whole army. Never mind, we will do it yet." Lee asked Longstreet to ride with him to Willis Church where D.H. Hill was. There, Hill told them that if McClellan was at Malvern Hill, they had better leave him alone. Longstreet jokingly stated, "Don't get scared now that we have got him whipped." The division commanders of Magruder, Huger, and Jackson attacked Malvern Hill. Lee assigned Longstreet the task of coordinating some of the units on the Confederate left. What followed was a destructive scene of carnage as brigades by themselves, and sometimes accompanied by a fellow brigade, repeatedly attacked the Union soldiers on Malvern Hill. Lead flew from the Federal guns with accuracy and destroyed many regiments as they charged up the hill. D.H. Hill would write after the battle that it was not war, it was murder. The next day, Longstreet met with Lee and Jackson at the Poindexter home. Longstreet asked if Lee was sending anyone into the city. Lee said yes, an orderly will be going soon. Can we do anything for you? Yes, Longstreet said. Send Mrs. Longstreet word I am alive yet. She is up at Lynchburg. Lee preferred not to have an orderly telegraph an officer's wife, so he advised Longstreet to write her a note instead. Lee then asked Longstreet what he thought of the fight at Malvern Hill. He said, "I think you hurt them about as much as they hurt you," to which Lee replied, "Then I am glad we punished them well at any rate." Jeb Stuart and Jefferson Davis then walked into the room. Davis had been at the front since the 30th. When the generals and the president finished talking, Charles Marshall of Lee's staff introduced a flask presented to him from General McCall. Lee, Jackson, and Stuart declined to drink. Davis took a little sip, and Longstreet took what one observer said was a soldierly swig. Then the rest of the contents were swallowed up by the staff members. The 7-day campaign had drained the Confederacy of manpower, producing over 20,000 casualties alone for the South, but it had eliminated the threat against the Confederate capital and put the Union Army on the defensive. One of Longstreet's biographers wrote, "Longstreet emerged from the campaign as Lee's most reliable subordinate commander. At Gaines' Mill and at Glendale, he had handled the command with a confidence and calmness that became a hallmark of his battlefield leadership." Less than a month after his performance at Seven Pines, Longstreet had redeemed himself. After being congratulated for the successful campaign, Lee stated, "Longstreet was the staff in my right hand." James Longstreet might have won the respect of Robert E. Lee, but he still had many critics. The Richmond Examiner wrote a lengthy article about the 7 Days Campaign, and in the description of the Battle of Glendale or Fraser's Farm, the author, John M. Daniel, wrote that A.P. Hill was in sole command of the troops, making it appear as though Longstreet was nowhere to be found. Longstreet would write a sketch of the battle and have it signed by his aide, Moxley Sorrell, and they submitted it to the Richmond Whig, the Examiner's competitor. In it, Longstreet derided Daniel, who had been on Hill's staff, for giving his former commander more credit than he deserved. However, Longstreet did not diminish Hill's role. He wanted to correct the statement that Hill was the commander on the field, when in fact it was himself who commanded his own division and Hill's in the engagement. Hill read Longstreet's article and felt that his own troops were slighted in the description and became angry at his commander. Hill wrote to Lee requesting that he be placed under another commander. When the request passed over Longstreet's desk, he endorsed it, saying, "Respectfully forwarded. If it is convenient to exchange the troops or to exchange the commanders, I see no particular reason why Major General A.P. Hill should not be gratified." Later, Longstreet requested information of Hill's troops through his aide Moxley Sorrell. When Hill returned it, with a note saying he did not wish to hold further communication with Sorrell, Longstreet became furious at the insubordination. He gave another order to Hill, but it was returned as well. Longstreet would eventually send Sorrell to place Hill under arrest, confined to his camp and vicinity. A series of letters passed between the two men until finally Hill challenged Longstreet to a duel. Before it could come to violence, Lee was able to smooth over the disagreement and then granted Hill his transfer, sending Hill and his light division to Gordonsville to fight under Stonewall Jackson. Jackson and his troops were operating north of Richmond, but Longstreet and his now 5 divisions were watching McClellan's army, which still sat at Harrison's Landing, protected by nearby gunboats. As the divisions under Longstreet kept an eye on McClellan, they also kept their eyes on playing cards. Poker was played throughout the camps, and as Lee and Longstreet rode through them, Lee asked Longstreet if he could do something about the gambling. Longstreet said he would look into it, but the poker player he was knew that the men would gamble no matter what orders came down the chain of command, so he ultimately did nothing to stop them. To the north, the Union High Command had combined all of the troops in northern Virginia into one army, the Army of Virginia, commanded by one of Longstreet's West Point roommates, John Pope. Lee had dispatched Jackson to suppress Pope, but realized that Jackson could not do it alone, so Lee brought Longstreet north, boarding trains of the Virginia Central Railroad and speeding off north to link up with Jackson. Most of Longstreet's troops arrived at Gordonsville on the 13th of August. Jackson reported to Longstreet offering him command of all the troops, since he was the senior of the two. Longstreet declined for a couple of reasons. One, Jackson knew the terrain and the situation, and two, Lee would be along shortly, so there was no need for him to take command of Jackson's troops. Lee met with Longstreet and Jackson in Gordonsville, and decided to launch an attack on the flank of the Army of Virginia. Jackson's troops would cross the Rapidan River at Somerville Ford, Longstreet at Raccoon Ford, and Stuart's cavalry at Morton's Ford. The front was wide, and the cavalry had trouble screening the front of each infantry column, so when Longstreet crossed at Raccoon Ford and found no cavalry in his front, he ordered 2 regiments from Robert Toombs' brigade to picket the road in front of his column. Toombs himself was not with his brigade. He decided to visit the home of his congressional friend who lived in the area. When he returned to his unit, he found the 2 regiments guarding the ford. Toombs found that Longstreet had issued the order, then sent the 2 regiments back to camp, remarking that the road could be guarded with an old woman with a broomstick. When Longstreet found out about Toombs' actions, he placed the brigade commander under arrest. When Toombs attempted to contest his arrest, Longstreet sent him to Gordonsville. However, Longstreet liked the Georgian, and when Toombs wrote his commander a letter explaining his actions, Longstreet relented and placed him back in command of his brigade. One of Jeb Stuart's aides was captured during the march, and the orders to Stuart from Lee were captured by Union forces. With this new information, Pope began pulling his army back. From atop Clark's Mountain overlooking the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers, Lee and Longstreet watched the blue Union columns marching away from them. Lee turned to Longstreet and said, "General, we little thought that the enemy would turn his back upon us this early in the campaign." Lee, Longstreet, and Jackson gave chase across the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers. During the march, Longstreet's troops captured a Federal spy. The night before, one of Longstreet's couriers had been shot in the back and killed. The documents from the courier were found on the spy. Longstreet ordered him to be executed. Members of the Kirkwood Rangers of the 7th South Carolina Cavalry, the general's escort, hanged the spy and buried him beside the road. The chase continued, but with a change in tactics. Lee summoned Jackson to his headquarters. The commanding general wanted to force Pope north to give his own army supplies to live off in the northern Virginia countryside. Therefore, Jackson would march by a circuitous route to cut the supply train and the communications of the Union Army near Manassas Junction, forcing Pope to fall back. Jackson did as he was told, while Longstreet engaged with Pope in light skirmishing to hold the Union Army in place. With Pope now moving north, Lee presumed it was because he had found out Jackson was now north of his position. Lee now ordered Longstreet north. He could choose his own route and chose Jackson's circuitous route to avoid the Union Army performing any delaying tactics. Lee and Longstreet rode at the head of the column of gray-clad troops with a skirmish line in front to warn them of enemy troops in their front. Union troops put up some resistance at Thoroughfare Gap, but Longstreet pushed them back and reached the east side of the mountain. Gunfire could be heard from the fighting occurring near the first Manassas battlefield that was fought the year previous. Longstreet and Lee arrived near the battlefield in the late morning of August 29th. Jeb Stuart met them to inform the 2 men of the situation. Jackson wanted Longstreet to link up with his right flank astride the Warrenton Turnpike, and that is exactly what Longstreet did. Lee urged him to launch an attack, but Longstreet resisted, saying he wanted a reconnaissance of the area before he sent in his troops. Stuart rode to the southeast and found at least 1 corps approaching the Confederate right flank. Longstreet personally reconnoitered the ground and used a few of his brigades to engage with Federal forces by the evening, but he launched no major assault. That night, Lee met with Longstreet and Jackson and determined that they would wait for Pope to attack them, and when he did, they would trap the Union soldiers in a pincer-like maneuver. On August 30th, Pope attacked Jackson's lines. The time was perfect for Longstreet to launch his assault. As the Union soldiers attacked Jackson, Longstreet let loose his brigades, personally deploying many of them to chase the enemy toward the now famous Henry House Hill. For 4 hours, Longstreet's men attacked Pope's army. Lee sent orders to Jackson to move out, but Stonewall remained in his defensive position for 2 hours before moving out, and then he only did so lackadaisically, which allowed Pope to reinforce his troops fighting Longstreet. The attack was a brilliant tactical maneuver, but the slowness of Jackson prevented Lee and Longstreet from capitalizing on the assault. The Union Army of Virginia retreated to the northeast, with Jackson and Longstreet pursuing. The Second Battle of Bull Run ended with the Union sustaining over 13,000 casualties and the Confederacy losing over 8,000. To illustrate the savagery of the fight on August 30th, Longstreet lost about as many men in 4 hours as Jackson did in 2 days. The situation called for action, and there was but one opening, across the Potomac, Longstreet stated. To relieve the Virginia landscape from the ravages of war, Robert E. Lee and his commanders agreed that the time was ripe for an invasion. The army wasted no time in their movement. Longstreet began his march to Leesburg and began crossing the Potomac River. His troops would reach Frederick, Maryland on September 7th. Many citizens along the way welcomed the Confederates with cheers and offers of food. Lee, concerned about the rear of the army, wanted at least a portion of the army to return to Harper's Ferry and capture that garrison, but Longstreet advised against it, stating that it would be unwise to divide the army with the threat of Union forces so close at hand. The next day, Longstreet came to Lee's headquarters and met with Jackson and the army commander. The three men must have been a sight to see. Lee had his hands in splints because of a fall. Longstreet was stricken with a chafed heel and couldn't wear his boot on that foot, so he wore a carpet slipper, and Jackson had been thrown by his horse and was in obvious pain from the fall. The three men discussed Lee's plan to capture Harper's Ferry, and it was decided to divide the army. Longstreet suggested for the entire army to be used in the capture of the garrison, but Lee decided against it. But Lee did acquiesce to Longstreet offering more troops from his command to support Jackson in the capture. The entire Army of Northern Virginia moved to the west to use the mountains to protect them if the Union Army moved against their divided forces. Then Jackson moved with his command to Harper's Ferry, leaving Longstreet at Boonesboro. However, it didn't take long for Union forces to move on their position. Word came that a large Federal force was coming from the north via Hagerstown, and Lee dispatched Longstreet toward that town on September 11th. Lee accompanied Longstreet as they traveled. Longstreet got more worried and irritated at the further separation of the army. He turned to Lee and said, "General, I wish we could stand still and let the Yankees come to us." The march was grueling. Some men had forced marched many miles since leaving Richmond, and straggling became rampant. It was estimated that a quarter of the army was falling away as it marched north. To further add to the struggle, the citizens of this section of Maryland were less friendly to the Confederacy. Southern soldiers who ventured onto farms looking for food found insults thrown at them and shut doors. At Hagerstown, Longstreet's command got a little rest as they stayed there from the 12th to the 13th. However, the situation changed when Stuart informed Lee that the Union Army was moving across the Catoctin Mountains and would be pushing towards South Mountain very soon. Lee's divided force could be defeated in detail if he did not delay McClellan's army. Longstreet met with Lee and they discussed the new information. Longstreet suggested that his command pull back to Sharpsburg, Maryland, and set up defensive positions. That way, both halves of the army would be closer together, and if McClellan attacked Jackson, he could hit the Union Army in the flank and rear. But Lee waved off that idea and decided to make a stand at South Mountain. Longstreet defended Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, and Crampton's Gap. D.H. Hill's men fought tooth and nail against Union troops at Turner's Gap, but got mauled in the process. Longstreet examined the field and wrote Lee a note stating that they could not hold their position unless reinforced, so Lee agreed for the troops to fall back during the night. They would fall back to the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, where Lee placed his troops over the hills surrounding the community along the Antietam Creek. Longstreet's troops would arrive on the 15th. On the same day, Jackson sent word that Harper's Ferry had been captured. Lee believed that the slow-moving McClellan would not attack until the 17th, giving the Confederates one whole day to concentrate their troops. Longstreet made his headquarters at the farmhouse of Henry and Elizabeth Piper, about 500 yards south of the sunken road. The family made dinner for him and D.H. Hill, whose headquarters were also on the property. The family offered the gentlemen wine with their meal, but Longstreet declined, thinking it may be poisoned. But after D.H. Hill drank a glass and remained unfazed, Longstreet asked for a glass. The generals and their staff would sleep in the Piper's orchard that night. On the morning of September 16th, Longstreet ate breakfast with the Pipers and then looked over the positions of his troops with Lee. McClellan's army moved into position to attack on the 17th, just as Lee had predicted. On the morning of September 17th, the Battle of Antietam erupted on the hills surrounding the town of Sharpsburg. The beginning of the battle revolved around Miller's cornfield, the woods that flanked the field, and the Dunker Church. Longstreet supervised his troops on the right and then joined Lee and D.H. Hill at the sunken road. As they looked over the troops, Longstreet and Lee on foot and Hill on horseback, Longstreet said to Hill, "If you insist on riding up there and drawing the fire, give us a little interval so that we may not be in line of fire when they open on you." Just a few moments later, a cannon belched forth its projectile. Longstreet said to Hill, "That one was meant for you." A second later, the projectile took off the forelimbs of Hill's horse. Although a horrific sight, Longstreet found a little comedy in the situation. When Hill was puzzled about how to get off the panicked animal, Longstreet responded, "This side, Hill. No, the other. Get off over his head. Hill, slide off behind." Once Hill got off the animal, the horse was put down. A member of Hill's staff remembered that under fire Longstreet was cool and calm as if he was on dress parade. The only external indication of worry was that he seemed to bite clean through his tobacco at every chew of the cigar. From the Piper farm, Longstreet watched all over the battlefield, but paid close attention to the fighting happening at the sunken road, soon to be called Bloody Lane. He called up Richard Anderson's division to support Hill, but Anderson went down with a wound quickly, giving command to Roger Pryor. When artillery began to fall thick amongst his men, Pryor requested artillery support from Longstreet. Longstreet replied with a note reading, "I am sending you the guns, my dear General. This is a hard fight, and we had all better die than lose it." When a regiment mistakenly withdrew from the road, this resulted in the rest of the regiments and brigades pulling back as well, allowing the Union troops to breach the Confederate line. Miller's battery of the Washington artillery was sent by Longstreet to help stop the breakthrough, but Union artillery wounded many men of the gun crew, so Longstreet's staff, including Moxley Sorrell, Tom Gorey, Tom Walton, John Fairfax, and Peyton Manning, began loading the guns and pulling the lanyard to fire into the approaching blue troops. Longstreet perched atop his horse, holding the reins of his aides' horses, chewed on a cigar, and ordered canister to be loaded into the gun. A concentration of artillery fire from around the battlefield stalled the Union breakthrough and sent the blue troops backward. Although Longstreet got accolades for his performance at the sunken road, Longstreet, in a letter after the war, insisted that D.H. Hill was the hero of the day. He wrote, "Had the fight made by D.H. Hill been made by a Virginian, it would have been heralded as a wonderful achievement and to all time, but Hill was from far down in Dixie." On the Confederate route, Ambrose Burnside's Union Corps moved across Antietam Creek and was only stopped by A.P. Hill's Light Division that barely arrived in time to stop the Union assault. The Battle of Antietam ended as the bloodiest single day in American history with over 23,000 casualties. Longstreet's staff was hit hard. While manning the guns in the Piper orchard, Walton was hit by a bullet in the shoulder, Sorrell was knocked unconscious and bruised by the concussion of a shell burst, and John Fairfax lost his prized gray stallion named Saltron. Distraught, Fairfax rushed to Longstreet and said, "General, General, my horse is killed. Saltron is shot right in the back." Longstreet turned to his aide and gave him a weird look and stated, "Never mind, Major, you ought to be glad you are not shot in your own back." Lee wanted to stay on the field that night. He gathered his commanders together at his headquarters. Generals Jackson, D.H. Hill, A.P. Hill, Hood, Jubal Early, and David R. Jones attended. When Lee saw that General Longstreet had not joined them, he got terribly worried. He asked the others if they had seen the general. Longstreet then rode into headquarters smoking a cigar. An artillery shell had caught a house on fire in Sharpsburg, and he was helping the family put it out. Relieved at the sight of Longstreet, Lee walked up to him and grasped his subordinate's hand and said, "Ah, here is Longstreet. Here is my old war horse. Let us hear what he has to say." The two men talked together for a time, and then each division commander was given orders to cook rations for their soldiers at the front. They would stay the night and see what tomorrow brought. The battle did not continue the next day. George McClellan declined the fight, and Robert E. Lee was content to remain on the defensive. So Longstreet and the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River at Bottler's Ford and made it safely into Virginia. The Army camped near Winchester, Virginia, to rest from the hard campaigning over the last 4 months. In roughly 6 weeks, the ranks doubled as stragglers and those slightly wounded rejoined the ranks. Longstreet remarked that his men wished for the chance to convince the Yanks that Sharpsburg is but a trifle to what they can do. During this interlude between major engagements, the Army of Northern Virginia was reorganized, and most importantly to Longstreet, Army Corps were created, 2 of them, headed by 2 lieutenant generals. President Jefferson Davis asked Robert E. Lee to recommend 2 generals for those positions. Lee easily named Longstreet and Jackson, and the Confederate Senate approved Longstreet to rank from October 9th and Jackson to rank from October 10th, Longstreet still remaining the senior subordinate to Lee in the Army. One of Longstreet's biographers wrote of Jackson and Longstreet, "To Jackson, duty implied fighting. Fighting implied death. Jackson accepted casualties as war's consequence. He harbored no romantic illusions about warfare. He was a remorseless enemy, a warrior in the mold of a biblical Joshua. By contrast, Longstreet approached war dispassionately. No moral imperatives, no testing of men's characters drove his generalship as they did Jackson's. To Longstreet, victory resulted from preparation, deliberate, thoughtful planning. He believed in the strategic offensive and the tactical defensive. If Jackson was the Army's hammer, Longstreet was its anvil. To overcome the disparity in numerical strengths between the 2 opponents, Longstreet wanted to conserve his men's lives, not expend them in assaults. Risks had to be measured by costs. While he supported Lee's bold strategic movements, he became increasingly committed to the tactical defensive. He preferred the counterstrike to the attack. He believed that ultimately organization and the conservation of resources, manpower, and materiel, more than the fighting qualities of the troops, would result in Confederate independence. Also during this interlude, Longstreet wrote to his friend and former commander Joseph E. Johnston. Rumors swirled that Johnston would be sent to the Western Theater once he fully recovered from his wounds. Longstreet wrote to him that, although the officers and men had fought many battles and successfully under another leader, I feel that you have their hearts more decidedly than any other leader can ever have. The men would now go wild at the sight of their old favorite. I can't become reconciled at the idea of your going west. I command the 1st Corps in this army. If you will take it, you are more than welcome to it. I have no doubt but the command of the entire army will fall to you before spring. If it is possible for men to relieve you by going west, don't hesitate to send me. It would put me at no great inconvenience. On the contrary, it will give me pleasure if I can relieve you of it. I fear that you ought not go where you will be exposed to the handicaps that you will meet with out there. I am yet entirely sound and believe I can endure anything." This letter is revealing. It indicates that Longstreet viewed Johnston as a superior commander to Lee, most likely because Longstreet and Johnston had similar styles of warfare, Lee being much more aggressive than the other 2. Johnston serving as a corps commander would not have been realistic. Since he had commanded the army, it would not return to a subordinate role within it. The 1st Corps under Longstreet numbered around 41,000 men, and Jackson's 2nd Corps numbered around 38,000. Longstreet possessed 5 divisions of men, with his senior division commander being his childhood friend and West Point classmate Lafayette McLaws. The next in rank division commander in the 1st Corps was Richard Anderson, another 1842 graduate of West Point. Moxley Sorrell described Anderson as, "His courage was of the highest order, but he was indolent. His capacity and intelligence excellent, but it was hard to get him to use them. Withal of all nature so true and lovable, that it goes against me to criticize him." John Bell Hood, George Pickett, and Robert Ransom rounded out the divisions in Longstreet's 1st Corps. During the reorganization, one brigadier was passed over who felt he deserved to command a division. Cadmus Wilcox, a capable commander with division experience, believed he was unfairly passed over by both Hood and Pickett for division command in the 1st Corps. Pickett was clearly chosen by Longstreet because of their friendship, and Wilcox would never fully get over the promotion of Pickett over himself and become a harsh critic of Longstreet after the war for that decision. Edward Porter Alexander would join Longstreet's corps as the commander of Stephen D. Lee's old artillery battalion when Lee was transferred to Mississippi. The bond between Alexander and Longstreet would grow as the years went on, and Alexander would be one of Longstreet's most devoted admirers and promoters. After some rest, the Union Army eventually moved into Virginia once again, but McClellan moved too slowly for Abraham Lincoln, and he was replaced by Ambrose Burnside. Lee countered the Army of the Potomac's movement by sending Longstreet and his corps to Culpeper, Virginia, and when Burnside moved east toward Fredericksburg, Lee countered by moving his corps to that town. Longstreet's troops under William Barksdale engaged with Federal troops attempting to cross the river, and once across, the fight turned into urban warfare as they battled from house to house. Longstreet put his headquarters along with Lee on Telegraph Hill. Concerned about the landscape's ability to provide his troops with a sufficient defensive position, he ordered trenches, abattis, and other field works to protect his troops. When Longstreet requested Porter Alexander to bring up more artillery on Marye's Heights, Alexander said, "General, we cover that ground so well that we will comb it as with a fine-tooth comb. A chicken could not live on that field when we open on it." On the morning of December 13th, Longstreet mounted his horse Hero and rode to his division commanders. He told Hood to cooperate with Jackson's left flank and attack the Federals when they attacked Jackson's lines. He told Pickett to support Hood in this venture, then rode to Lee's headquarters. Longstreet was wearing a gray frock coat with no insignia and gray pants, with a lead-colored shawl over his shoulders to keep him warm. First, McLaws joined Longstreet, then Lee, then Jackson. They discussed the upcoming fight, and as Jackson was getting ready to ride off, Longstreet asked Stonewall, "Are you not scared of that file of Yankees you have before you down there?" Jackson responded, "Wait till they come a little nearer, and they shall either scare me or I'll scare them." Federal divisions hit Jackson's first line, then began massing and preparing to assault Marye's Heights. Wave after wave of blue troops marched up to the Confederate fortifications and melted away before the hail of lead and iron. Longstreet described it as the most fearful of carnage. During the attacks, Lee turned to Longstreet and said, "General, they are massing very heavily and will break your line, I am afraid." Longstreet responded with, "General, if you put every man now on the other side of the Potomac on that field to approach me over the same line, and give me plenty of ammunition, I will kill them all before they reach my line. Look to your right, you are in some danger there, but not on my line." Nevertheless, Longstreet replaced some of his troops that were running low on ammunition and reinforced his positions, and the slaughter continued. Burnside eventually called off the attacks and pulled his army back across the Rappahannock River. Longstreet, Jackson, and Lee had fended off persistent attacks and won a great victory against the much larger Army of the Potomac. Near Fredericksburg, a train came to a stop, and Longstreet waited anxiously for the passengers to disembark from the train to the platform. Louise stepped from the train, and her and the general hugged, and then proceeded to an ambulance wagon that they used to transport her to Longstreet's headquarters. It was December 28, 1862, and Louise was to stay with her husband for a little while. She would stay at the family estate of Matilda Hamilton. Her and Louise would spend time together while Longstreet performed his military duties, but the general would visit throughout the day and spend every night with her. For the first couple of days riding back and forth from his headquarters to the Hamilton home, he passed through the camp of the Texas Brigade, who lobbed snowballs at him. Finally, after enduring it a few times, he found a line of them standing with snowballs in hand. He rode up to them and exclaimed, "Throw your snowballs, men, if you want to, as much as you please, but if one of them touches me, not a man in this brigade shall have a furlough this winter. Remember that." Not a snowball touched him. Poker was played nightly by Longstreet's staff, and hard liquor was passed around. On at least one occasion, Longstreet indulged and played a game of poker, and became so drunk that he rode around on the back of a staff officer around the tent until both fell to the ground. During the winter, Longstreet's mind drifted west. His friend Joseph E. Johnston was heading to Tennessee, and after the defeat at Stone's River, Southerners clamored for the removal of Braxton Bragg as commander of the Army of Tennessee. Longstreet wrote to Lewis T. Wigfall, a former subordinate who resigned his commission to take a seat in the Confederate Senate, that he desired to be sent west because there seemed to be opportunities for all kinds of moves to great advantages. Longstreet advised Lee that one Army Corps could hold the line along the Rappahannock, and the other, his, could be transported by train to Tennessee to help defeat the Union Army of the Cumberland. It can be assumed that Longstreet thought that with Johnston directly over him in the west, he could secure him the position of the Army of Tennessee if Bragg made another mistake. Lee waved off such a plan, but he did dispatch Longstreet, but not to Tennessee. Federal forces were being reinforced in southeastern Virginia and the coast of North Carolina. The 9th Army Corps steamed down the Potomac, so Lee sent Longstreet with 2 divisions, John Bell Hood's and George Pickett's, to the east of Richmond. G.W. Smith had resigned his position as commander of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina. Longstreet would assume that role. The department encompassed the land between New Bern, North Carolina, to Richmond, Virginia. Longstreet went to work stopping Federal incursions into the area, but he kept sufficient troops on hand to send to Lee at a moment's notice, in case General Hooker attempted to attack the Army of Northern Virginia. Southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina had been relatively untouched by Federal forces and had an abundance of foodstuffs that Lee's army could use, so Longstreet made preparations for the wheat, corn, and livestock to be sent north to the Rappahannock River. Longstreet distributed Pickett's division through northeastern North Carolina, laying siege to Washington, North Carolina, but failed to dislodge the Union troops. Despite some failures, the pressure put on the Federals convinced them not to invade too far inland. By April, Lee's army was barely holding on. Surviving on half rations and scurvy plagued the camps. Something had to be done to feed the troops. Lee and Longstreet decided to move toward the Union-occupied town of Suffolk, Virginia, in the form of a supply expedition. The divisions of Pickett and Hood arrived near the city on April 11th. Around 17,000 men dispersed through a 14-mile set of entrenchments around the city opposed Longstreet's troops. The general asked for naval assistance, knowing that only with its help could he capture the city. The president refused to release an ironclad to seal off the river approach. Longstreet estimated that an assault would result in about 3,000 casualties, so he settled in for a siege. Light skirmishing and artillery duels characterized the fighting at Suffolk, but a larger action occurred at Hill's Point, where Confederate artillery battled with Union gunboats. 270 men from Connecticut and New York landed by transport, drove away the Alabama infantry protecting the artillery, and captured the Southern artillery. It was a horrible blunder on the part of the Confederates. Longstreet was furious and blamed Samuel French, who commanded the artillery, even though he was in a sickbed when it occurred. French asked for a court of inquiry when reports he assumed from Longstreet spread that he was inadequate for his position, but President Davis denied the request. Beyond fighting, Longstreet had other problems. One of his division commanders, George Pickett, being close to the home of his sweetheart, would visit her incessantly, to the point that Longstreet got tired of it and denied him leave to visit. Pickett attempted to go around asking for Longstreet's permission and just ask Moxley Sorrell, but Sorrell said no, that he must ask the lieutenant general. Pickett pleaded with him, saying, "But he is tired of it and will refuse, and I must go. I must see her. I swear, Sorrell, I'll be back before anything can happen in the morning." Still, Sorrell refused to give him permission. Pickett then snuck away secretly to visit Sally. It was while Longstreet was commanding the department that he was introduced by a letter of introduction from the Secretary of War James Seddon to Henry Thomas Harrison, also known as Harrison the Scout. The professional scout was paid in United States greenbacks, not Confederate notes, which made him expensive, but he was good at his job. The supply expedition was a success. Longstreet's commissary chief collected enough supplies in the department to feed Lee's army for about 2 months. At the end of April, the military situation changed. Hooker's army was on the move, getting ready to cross the Rappahannock River. Lee wired Longstreet to his assistance. It would take some time to get the provisions on the way, but Longstreet prepared to go. Longstreet's troops and he himself wouldn't arrive in Richmond from Suffolk until May 5th. The fighting at Chancellorsville would end on May 6th. Longstreet has long been criticized for not being with Lee at Chancellorsville, but he is not to blame. His job was to secure food for the Army of Northern Virginia. When Lee called him north, Longstreet had to make sure the wagons laden with goods made it to their destination, and that would take time. Even Lee admitted that he did not believe Longstreet would arrive in time. Therefore, Longstreet is not at fault. Despite his absence, Lee won an incredible victory at Chancellorsville, defeating a numerically superior force with a large section of his own force absent. On May 6th, Longstreet met with Secretary of War James Seddon. He discussed the war in the West. Longstreet's friend, Ulysses S. Grant, was heavily involved in operations to secure the Mississippi River for the Union, and William S. Rosecrans of the Army of the Cumberland occupied Middle Tennessee. Longstreet suggested that Johnston's force in Mississippi be combined with Bragg's and send himself with Pickett and Hood to Tennessee to grow the numbers of that army, to overwhelm Rosecrans and push north, threatening Cincinnati. Longstreet hoped that would pull Grant away from the Mississippi River. Lee had made his thoughts known to Seddon and the President. He didn't believe such an invasion would stop Grant from trying to capture Vicksburg. He also thought that sending Pickett or Hood or both to Tennessee wouldn't be wise because the Union could shift troops between theaters quicker than they could. This would put the Army of Northern Virginia at a disadvantage. Ultimately, it was decided to send Longstreet back to Lee. Hopefully, another invasion of the North by Lee could divert the attention from the Mississippi and relieve other areas of the South. On May 9, 1863, James Longstreet arrived near the winter quarters of the Army of Northern Virginia and its leader, Robert E. Lee. The two men discussed the events that transpired during the Battle of Chancellorsville and Jackson's wounding. Lee was obviously concerned about his wounded corps commander. The next day, a little after 3 p.m., Jackson would pass away. Without the commander of the 2nd Corps, Lee now turned solely to Longstreet to discuss the upcoming campaign. Longstreet, after the war, devoted numerous pages describing the meetings he had with Lee from May 11th to the 13th. It was during those meetings that they constructed what would become known as the Gettysburg Campaign. During those meetings, Longstreet proposed again to send 2 divisions of his corps and himself to Tennessee, combine that force with the Army of Tennessee and Joseph E. Johnston's troops, overpower the Army of the Cumberland near Nashville, then invade Kentucky and threaten Cincinnati. Longstreet believed that was the only way to stop the capitulation of Vicksburg. When Lee suggested an invasion into Pennsylvania, Longstreet believed the campaign would take too long and Vicksburg would fall before it concluded. Longstreet would say later that it became useless and improper to offer suggestions leading to a different course. All that I could ask was that the policy of the campaign should be one of defensive tactics, that we should work so as to force the enemy to attack us in such a good position as we might find in his own country, so well adapted to that purpose, which might assure us of a grand triumph. To this he readily assented as an important and material adjunct to his general plan. Despite his caveats to Lee's plan, a contemporary letter written to Senator Wigfall reveals Longstreet's confidence in an invasion of Pennsylvania. He said, "If we could cross the Potomac with 150,000 men, I think we could demand Lincoln to declare his purpose. If it is a Christian purpose, enough of blood has been shed to satisfy any principles. If he intends extermination, we should know it at once and play a little at that game whilst we can." Longstreet saw the value in taking the war into the North, and these statements reveal that he was not as Western-centric as his later writings may have alluded. Lee would travel to Richmond to meet with President Davis and the cabinet members and remain there from May 14th to the 18th. The cabinet voted in favor of the invasion. Before the Army of Northern Virginia marched off for Pennsylvania, Lee reorganized the army. He had thought hard about it even before Jackson's death, but now, with the general's death, it was the perfect time. He would replace Jackson with Richard Ewell and create another corps, the 3rd Corps, and give it to A.P. Hill. Furthermore, Lee took divisions from the 1st and 2nd Corps to create the 3rd. Longstreet's reorganized corps would be composed of the divisions of Lafayette McLaws, John Bell Hood, and George Pickett. Longstreet agreed with the placement of Richard Ewell to corps commander, but thought less of A.P. Hill, who he saw as inferior to Ewell. Longstreet preferred placing D.H. Hill in command of the 3rd Corps. Lee had grown disappointed in Lafayette McLaws's generalship. Illness made his performance at Chancellorsville lackluster, and the army commander asked Longstreet to inquire of his division commander's health and see if he would be open to other service. McLaws said his health was fine and resisted reassignment, even after Longstreet offered to send him further south and possibly switch the division commander with Beauregard, who would come to Northern Virginia with a corps to help during the summer. Nevertheless, McLaws stayed. However, because he stayed, Lee made it clear to Longstreet that any mistake McLaws made during the campaign, that Longstreet would be held responsible. Longstreet affirmed that he understood and promised to give personal attention to the division and its commander. This shift in relationship between Longstreet and McLaws would be the start of a rift between the two men. On June 3rd, the Army of Northern Virginia began marching north. Before the campaign, Lee would write about his army that the country cannot overestimate its worth. There never were such men in any army before and never can be again. If properly led, they will go anywhere and never fail at the work before them. The march was quick and brutal in the summer heat. Longstreet crossed and recrossed the Shenandoah River to support Stuart's cavalry as they guarded the gaps in the Blue Ridge, providing a screening movement for the army. As Longstreet surveyed his troops, an officer said that the general must be tired. Longstreet responded, "No, I have never felt fatigue in my life." As the army marched north, Lee accompanied Longstreet. They stayed close, with Lee seeking the general's advice through every phase of the campaign. By June 27th, part of the army had made it to Chambersburg. The town flooded with soldiers, and Longstreet and Lee made their headquarters in a grove of trees outside the town known as Shatter's Woods. On the march, a British observer named Arthur Freemantle, part of the Coldstream Guards, attached himself to Longstreet's staff. He wrote of Lee and Longstreet, "The relations between him and Longstreet are quite touching. They are almost always together. Longstreet's corps complain of this sometimes, as they say that they seldom get a chance of detached service, which falls to the lot of Ewell. It is impossible to please Longstreet more than by praising Lee. I believe these two generals to be as little ambitious and as thoroughly unselfish as any men in the world." On June 28th, with the absence of Jeb Stuart's cavalry, Lee and Longstreet got their first piece of solid intelligence about the Union Army. Harrison the Scout, paid in gold coins at the beginning of the month by Longstreet, had found Longstreet's headquarters and reported that the Union Army was on the move through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Upon hearing the news, Lee recalled Ewell from Carlisle in order to concentrate his forces. On the 30th, Lee and Longstreet moved eastward toward Cashtown, and they set up their headquarters near a deserted sawmill. Lee made the statement earlier in the day that, "Tomorrow, gentlemen, we will not move to Harrisburg as we expected, but will go over to Gettysburg and see what General Meade is after." On July 1st, the two armies engaged at the little town of Gettysburg. Longstreet, Lee, and Freemantle advanced along the Chambersburg pike, and as they rode along, men from Edward Johnson's division of Ewell's corps, who had never seen Longstreet, got close to the general. When some Floridians saw Longstreet, they cried out, "Look out for work now, boys, for here's the old bulldog again." As the generals got closer to the battle, Longstreet observed the Federals regrouping on high ground beyond the town. He commented to Lee that, "We could not call the enemy to position better suited to our plans. All that we have to do is file around his left and secure good ground between him and his capital." Lee did not like that idea and jabbed his fist into his hand, saying, "If the enemy is there tomorrow, we must attack him." Longstreet responded, "If he is there, it will be because he is anxious that we should attack him, a good reason, in my judgment, for not doing so." Longstreet's proposal to move between the Union Army and the capital was impracticable at that moment. Lee did not know where the Union Army was. In fact, many of the corps were on their way to Gettysburg, which means a movement in that direction would put them in collision with the rest of the Union Army. For that moment, Lee's directive for an attack the next day was the better course of action. Longstreet bedded down beside the road where his divisions rested. One could only imagine he got little sleep as he dreaded an attack the next day. Before the sun rose on July 2, 1863, James Longstreet, after just a few hours of sleep, rode to Seminary Ridge to meet with Robert E. Lee. Lee himself had awakened early, ate breakfast, and began preparations for the day. When the two met, Lee notified Longstreet that he intended to continue the offensive. Longstreet objected and suggested they swing past the Union left flank and place themselves between Washington and the Union Army. Lee rejected the proposal, then summoned Captain Samuel Johnston, an engineer from his staff, to reconnoiter the Federal position. He would be accompanied by an engineer under Longstreet, Major John Clark. After they went on their way, Lee, Longstreet, A.P. Hill, Henry Heath, and John Bell Hood met north of the seminary buildings that gave Seminary Ridge its name. 3 hours later, Johnston and Clark found Lee, A.P. Hill, and Longstreet discussing the possibilities for the day. The two engineers had rode southeast to the Peach Orchard, crossed the Emmitsburg Road, and along the base of two hills, called Big Round Top and Little Round Top. Aside from 4 Federal cavalrymen, the engineers found no enemy troops. Lee, excited and inquisitive, pointed to the two hills and asked, "Did you get there?" Johnston answered in the affirmative. The three generals met for a few moments, then Longstreet and Hill walked away. Lee told Johnston to join Longstreet. Johnston believed that meant for him to aid him in any way that he could. The information Johnston gave Lee was inaccurate, though. Union infantry of the 3rd Corps occupied the ground to the north of the two hills, and although mist could have obscured the view of the staff member, he should have been able to hear the men and animals not too far away. This would have serious implications for the day's fighting. Lafayette McLaws arrived to meet with Lee and Longstreet. Although most agree that he arrived after Johnston had returned with the information, McLaws argued that he arrived before the staffer returned. If he had arrived before, then Lee would not have had the information claimed in the account, but this is how McLaws remembered it. According to McLaws, Lee pointed to a map he was holding and drew a perpendicular line across the Emmitsburg Road, saying, "General, I wish you to place your division across this road, and I wish you to get there, if possible, without being seen by the enemy. Can you get there?" McLaws responded, "I know of nothing to prevent me," then asked permission to reconnoiter the ground. Lee informed him that Johnston was already doing it, so McLaws requested permission to join Johnston. Longstreet, who was pacing not too far away and listening to the conversation, came over and exclaimed, "No, sir, I do not wish you to leave your division." Longstreet then pointed to the map and drew a parallel line to the Emmitsburg Road, not a perpendicular line as Lee had done. Longstreet then said, "I wish your division placed so." Lee then interrupted, saying, "No, General, I wish it placed just perpendicular to that." Again, McLaws requested to reconnoiter the ground, and again Longstreet denied him. With that, McLaws rode back to his division to get them in place. Lee then rode to meet with General Ewell on the left flank. By 11 o'clock, he was back on Seminary Ridge, where Longstreet got his orders to advance the divisions of McLaws and Hood. Evander Law's brigade of Hood's division was going to be late, so he requested a delay to wait for the brigade. Lee agreed, and then rode off. Even some of Longstreet's supporters, like Edward Porter Alexander and his aide Moxley Sorrell, saw that Longstreet did not go about his work with the vigor with which he performed previous military duties assigned to him by Lee. According to one of his biographers, he may have let his disagreement with Lee influence his performance. What was lacking in Longstreet was the energetic and careful preparation that had been a hallmark of his generalship at 2nd Manassas, Sharpsburg, and Fredericksburg. The failings on this day, however, were not solely Longstreet's. Like an ungainly beast, the Confederate Army stumbled into battle on July 2nd. McLaws's division led Longstreet's corps, with McLaws and Johnston in the lead. Longstreet rode in front of Hood's division. As the lead division was about to crest a hill, McLaws and Johnston realized that Little Round Top could be seen, and the signal station there would pick up their movement. When the column of troops stopped, Longstreet rode to see what was the matter. After explaining the situation to his corps commander, McLaws commented that they would have to countermarch to get to another route, so Longstreet told them to countermarch. Johnston claimed that he recommended to avoid the hill by going through a field like the artillery had done, but Longstreet preferred to use the road. It was around 3 p.m. before the first of McLaws' troops made it to the field, but when artillery opened up on his lead brigade under Joseph Kershaw, McLaws realized that Longstreet had been wrong when he told him that he would be on the flank, that no enemy troops would be opposite him. McLaws wanted to attack, but Longstreet held off until Hood could deploy his troops. Hood sent scouts to his front and determined that he could swing around to the right and flank the Union position. Longstreet denied the request no less than 4 times, then rode to Hood personally to order him to attack, then rode back to observe the assaults. In the words of a Texan, he sat astride his horse like an iron man, with his spyglass to his eye, coolly watching the effect of our shots. Limbs of trees fell and crashed around him, yet he sat as unmoved as a statue. The attack began at around 4 p.m. Hood's men attacked Devil's Den, the Valley of Death, the Wheat Field, and the Round Tops, while McLaws' troops attacked the Wheat Field and the Peach Orchard. Behind the Mississippians of William Barksdale and their successful charge came the Georgians of William Wofford. Ahead of the men from Georgia was Longstreet himself. When the brigade saw him, they cheered. Longstreet shouted, "Cheer less, men, and fight more." The Georgians passed a group of prisoners captured by the Mississippians. One of the Federals asked who the general was. When the man found out it was Longstreet, he stated, "No wonder we are thrashed upon every field. There is not in the whole of our army a lieutenant general who would have risked his life in such a charge." Longstreet remained at the Peach Orchard watching the attacks take place. Not since his time at the Piper Farm at Antietam did he get so close to the fighting. One of his biographers claimed that it may be because he promised Lee that he would take personal responsibility for McLaws' performance. While watching Hood and more closely McLaws' division, General Pickett approached. He and his men had come from Chambersburg, and he had rode ahead to receive his orders. After watching the battle with his friend, Pickett then went back to his division, finding out that Lee did not need him that day, that he would be sent for when ready. Longstreet called off the assaults when it got dark, but did not report personally to Lee. Instead, he sent an aide to relay a summary of the day's actions. One of Longstreet's biographers explained the situation well when he wrote, "His decision not to confer with Lee was probably due more to his mood than to the necessity for a short horseback ride. He had watched his two divisions fight magnificently only to suffer heavy losses in an attack he never wanted. He had been unable to conceal his anger with Lee's plan, and after the sacrifice he had witnessed, his dissatisfaction could only have been worse that night. Lee issued orders that the offensive would be continued at daylight the next day. Longstreet would claim that he never received the order, and neither he nor Lee informed Pickett of his role. Although he claimed to have not received the order, Edward Porter Alexander's version of events described him going to Longstreet's headquarters and the corps commander informing him that they would renew the attack at daylight. Nevertheless, Longstreet went to bed that night angry at the horrendous loss of life that day, despite his objections to the plan. Robert E. Lee rode to the Confederate right to find Longstreet at sunrise. When he found Longstreet, the 1st Corps commander explained to him that, "General, I have had my scouts out all night, and I find that you still have an excellent opportunity to move around to the right of Meade's army and maneuver him into attacking us." After listening to Longstreet explain, Lee waved off such a maneuver and pointed towards Cemetery Ridge and said he would attack that position with the 3 divisions of the 1st Corps. Longstreet responded, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know, as well as anyone, what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arranged for battle can take that position." The two men discussed it a little further, but Longstreet realized that Lee would not budge on his decision. Lee then jabbed his fist towards Cemetery Ridge and declared, "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him." The two men then rode off close to the Emmitsburg Road and observed the Federal position. Soon they were joined by A.P. Hill and Henry Heath. Longstreet explained that Hood and McLaws' divisions were too badly hurt from the previous day to be used in a main assault on this day, and it was decided that Pickett's fresh division and brigades from Hill's corps would be used to spearhead and support the attack. A large artillery bombardment would take place before the infantry attack to soften up the Federal position and neutralize the Federal artillery. Preparations began to form up the infantry for their assault on Cemetery Ridge. Pickett's division would be in 2 lines, 2 brigades in front and 1 in back. The brigades from Hill's corps on Pickett's left were still suffering from their devastating fight on the first day, and Longstreet would say that sending them into battle on the 3rd day was a grievous error. Nevertheless, Lee assigned Longstreet to the role of commander of the attack, even over the troops of A.P. Hill. Hill even said in his report that he ordered his brigades to report to Longstreet, but Longstreet did not position those troops. They were left to themselves, it seems. Hill, presumably not wanting to step on Longstreet's toes when that general was given command of the attack, did not position them either. All of the preparations were completed between 11 a.m. and noon. At 11:45 a.m., Longstreet sent a message to Porter Alexander, the commander of his artillery, saying, "If the artillery fire does not have the effort to drive off the enemy or greatly demoralize him, so as to make our effort pretty certain, I would prefer that you should not advise General Pickett to make the charge. I shall rely a great deal upon your judgment to determine the matter, and shall expect you to let General Pickett know when the moment offers." Longstreet was evidently attempting to shift responsibility to Alexander. The artilleryman became concerned over the note and asked Brigadier General Ambrose Wright, who was meeting with him when the note arrived, about it. Then Alexander wrote back to Longstreet, "General, I will only be able to judge the effect of our fire on the enemy by his return fire, as his infantry is but little exposed to view, and the smoke will obscure the whole field. If, as I infer from your note, there is any alternative to this attack, it would be carefully considered before opening our fire, for it will take all the artillery ammunition we have left to test this one thoroughly, and if the result is unfavorable, we will have none left for another effort, and even if this is entirely successful, it can only be so at a very bloody cost." At 12:15, Longstreet responded, "The intention is to advance the infantry. If the artillery has the desired effect of driving the enemy off, or having other effects such as to warrant us in making the attack." Alexander rode to Pickett to confer with the Virginian, and finding Pickett in good spirits about the attack, he wrote back to Longstreet, "When our artillery fire is at its best, I will advise General Pickett to advance." At around 1 p.m., over 150 cannons opened up on the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Amid the hail of iron and explosions, the Confederate troops organized for the attack waited anxiously. Brigadier General James Kemper of Pickett's division remembered, "While this was going on, Longstreet rode slowly and alone immediately in front of our entire line. He sat his large charger with a magnificent grace and composure I never before beheld. His bearing was to me the grandest moral spectacle of the war. I expected to see him fall every instant. Still, he moved on, slowly and majestically, with an inspiriting confidence, composure, self-possession, and repressed power in every movement and look that fascinated me. As Longstreet approached, Kemper walked toward him and said, "General, this is a terrible place." "What, is your command suffering?" asked Longstreet. "Yes, a man is cut to pieces here every second while we are talking. Sometimes a dozen are killed at one shot." Longstreet responded, "Is it possible? Can't you find any safer position for your men?" "No, we are exactly behind the line of this crest, the very safest place about here." "I am greatly distressed at this," Longstreet replied. "Greatly distressed at this, but let us hold our ground a while longer. We are hurting the enemy badly, and will charge them presently." Alexander observed during the cannonade that the Union guns were not stopping or becoming neutralized like he had hoped. Then he thought he saw a number of guns being dragged away. He wrote a quick note to Pickett. "The 18 guns have been driven off. For God's sake, come on quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition nearly out." The courier carrying that message found Pickett and Longstreet together. The corps commander looked grim as Pickett read the message. Pickett asked, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet could not speak. He turned his face away and nodded. Pickett saluted, mounted his horse, and said, "I shall lead my division forward, sir." Longstreet then rode Alexander and inquired about the artillery. Alexander stated to Longstreet that his ammunition chests were empty, and he would have trouble supporting the infantry. Longstreet wanted to halt Pickett's division until the ammunition could be replenished, but Alexander explained it would take over an hour to get all of that accomplished, and the Union forces would only fortify their position more in that time. Longstreet told Alexander, "I don't want to make this attack. I believe it will fail. I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it even now, but that General Lee has ordered it and expects it." Pickett's men began their march, and Longstreet sat on a rail fence, watching his veteran troops march into the jaws of death. Longstreet sent staffers to urge the support on Pickett's right and left forward. In the late stages of the attack, the British soldier Arthur Fremantle found Longstreet, saying he wouldn't have missed this for anything. Longstreet responded, "The devil you wouldn't. I would have liked to have missed it very much. We've attacked and been repulsed. Look there." The divisions and brigades that took part in the assault began streaming back to Seminary Ridge after being defeated. Longstreet and Lee rode along the lines and encouraged the men and attempted to raise their spirits. The two generals conferred with one another and decided to order a retreat. By the middle of the month, the Army of Northern Virginia was back in Virginia. Once back in Virginia, Longstreet's troops occupied the right of the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg. He would make his headquarters at the home of Erasmus Taylor, a former staff officer in D.R. Jones's command. The estate was called Meadow Farm, and Taylor and his wife supplied the general and his staff with fresh food. While he and his command sat across the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers from the Union Army of the Potomac, the Battle of Gettysburg haunted Longstreet. He couldn't get over the uncalled-for loss of life. He sent a private letter to Secretary of War James Seddon, asking to be sent west to serve under Johnston. He would also write to his friend Senator Wigfall that, "If I remain here, I fear that we shall go, little at a time, till all will be lost. I hope that I may go west in time to save what there is left of us. I dislike to ask for anything, and will only do it under the impression that if I do not, our days will be numbered." He then assured Wigfall that he had no personal motive in this, for with either Bragg's or Pemberton's army, I shall be second to Johnston, and therefore in the same relative position as I am at present. I am not essential here. On the contrary, I am satisfied that it is a great mistake to keep me here. Clearly from the letter, Longstreet had grown concerned over the aggressive tactics of Lee, and possibly hoped that by removing him from the Army of Northern Virginia, that may make Lee less aggressive, since he would have less troops. It was also possible that he hoped to take command of the Army of Tennessee, since Seddon had been toying with the idea of replacing Bragg with Longstreet. By this point in the war, much attention at the capital shifted west, especially after Vicksburg fell and Lee lost Gettysburg. The Army of Tennessee was looked to as a hope in the tragic year of 1863 for the Confederacy. Davis called Lee to the capital to discuss the next stage of the conflict. While Lee met with Davis, Longstreet commanded the Army of Northern Virginia in his absence. Lee suggested that his army make another offensive against Meade, going so far as to order Longstreet to prepare the army for an offensive. The order disturbed Longstreet, who responded in a lengthy letter on September 2nd. In it, he stated that he saw no reason to launch an offensive unless they were going to cross the Potomac River again. But that he preferred to leave 2 corps in Virginia while sending another corps to help the Army of Tennessee. In a letter sent a few days later, Longstreet requested at least 3 brigades be sent west, along with replacing Bragg with himself. He stated, "I doubt if General Bragg has confidence in his troops or himself either. He is not likely to do a great deal for us." On September 5th, Davis and Lee agreed to dispatch Longstreet with 2 infantry divisions to the Army of Tennessee. The next day, Lee sent Longstreet orders to move his command. Longstreet would remain another day to see to the loading of his troops. The scale of logistics was enormous to send those 2 divisions west. Government agents coordinated with 16 railroad companies to gather railroad cars and change schedules and reroute trains. Longstreet, before leaving, went to Lee's headquarters to say his farewells. Longstreet then put his foot in his stirrup to mount his horse to leave when Lee walked up to his corps commander, placed his hand on his shoulder, and stated, "General, you must beat those people out there." The 2 men shook hands, and Longstreet rode away. It would be 7 months before they saw each other again. Longstreet first traveled to Richmond. On the 11th, Longstreet had dinner with President Davis, and by the 14th he was heading toward Georgia. Accidents and different gauges of track delayed the Confederate troops. In Raleigh, North Carolina, some Georgia troops attacked the Raleigh Standard newspaper office because they were known to criticize the war. Longstreet himself arrived at Ringgold, Georgia by September 19th. Without horses awaiting him and his staff, the group of men had to wait 2 hours until their horses arrived on a second train. Longstreet, Muxley Sorrell, and Peyton Manning rode along the windy roads to the site of battle along Chickamauga Creek. They could hear cannons belching forth projectiles and musketry as they traveled. Part of Longstreet's corps had made it to the battlefield and were being led by John Bell Hood in Longstreet's absence. As it was getting dark, the 3 men stumbled upon a Union picket line. The darkness concealed that Longstreet was the enemy, and the 2 sides passed a few words between them. Then the Confederate general and his staffers rode off. As they left, the Union pickets realized they were the enemy and released a harmless volley from their rifled muskets. When they finally found Braxton Bragg, the Army commander was asleep in an ambulance wagon. The 2 generals talked for nearly an hour, with Bragg pointing out the dispositions of troops on a crude map and informing him that the army would be divided into 2 wings, with Leonidas Polk commanding the right wing, while Longstreet would command the left wing. Longstreet would also be given command of Simon Bolivar Buckner's corps, Thomas Hindman's division, and Bushrod Johnson's division, as well as his own troops to make the attack the next day. Longstreet and his staffers went to sleep on a bed of leaves, then awoke before daylight the next day to inform his division and corps commanders of the plan for the day's attack. He first sought out Alexander P. Stewart and his division on the far right of Longstreet's line. Stewart and Longstreet had attended West Point together, and Longstreet advised Stewart on the attack he was to make. Next, he went to Buckner, Johnson, and Hood. Hood recalled that Longstreet responded with that confidence which had so often contributed to his extraordinary success, that we would of course whip and drive him from the field. I could but exclaim that I was rejoiced to hear him so express himself, as he was the first general I had met since my arrival who talked of victory. Longstreet packed 8 brigades opposite the Brotherton Farm and Field on the east side of the Lafayette Road to deliver a devastating attack to the Federal troops. After delays and miscommunication, the right wing finally launched their attack, signaling to Longstreet to launch his own. It was about 11 a.m. On the Union side, General Thomas Wood was pulling his division out of line to fill an alleged gap in the Union line. It happened at the right moment for Longstreet's men, who burst forth from the tree line and across the Lafayette Road, penetrating the Union line. Longstreet rode a few lines back and personally directed General Deas to support Bushrod Johnson's left. A lieutenant in Deas' command recalled, "Longstreet is the boldest and bravest looking man I ever saw. I don't think he would dodge if a shell were to burst under his chin." As the Confederate juggernaut went into the Union lines, some stiff resistance lay ahead. Henry Benning's Georgians pushed back one brigade only to be thrown back by another. When they broke, a hysteric Benning rode to Longstreet saying, "General, I am ruined. My brigade was suddenly attacked and every man killed. Not one is to be found. Please give orders where I can do some fighting." Longstreet responded, "Nonsense, General, you are not so badly hurt. Look about you. I know you will find at least one man, and with him on his feet, report your brigade to me, and you too shall have a place in the fighting line." Colonel Thomas Claiborne, attached to Buckner's staff, rode to Longstreet and informed him that William Preston's division was being held in reserve. As they sat on their horses, a shell whizzed by, and Claiborne ducked. "I see you salute them," Longstreet joked. "Yes, every time," Claiborne responded. Longstreet stated, "If there is a shell or bullet over there destined for us, it will find us." About 1 p.m., John Bell Hood went down with a wound to his leg and was carried off the field where a surgeon would amputate the limb. Brigadier General Benjamin Humphreys, who commanded the Mississippians formerly under Barksdale, rode to Longstreet for orders. Longstreet said, "Drive them, General. These Western men can't stand it any better than the Yankees we left in Virginia. Drive them." Longstreet rode to the right of his line as his left attacked gathering troops on Snodgrass Hill. When he got near Kelly Field, he came under fire from Union soldiers who were still holding out against Polk's right wing. Longstreet then moved south to avoid the enemy. He ordered his men to reorganize and rest, and left the rest of the engagement to his subordinates. He returned with his staff to the Brotherton farm, where they delighted in a lunch that included taters, which they had not gotten a steady supply of in Virginia. While they ate, a shell burst over their heads, and a piece of it scraped Manning's scalp. He began gasping for air. The rest of the staffers ran to him, thinking him mortally wounded, but he was choking on a tater that he was attempting to eat when the shell burst overhead. The staffer recovered, and they continued to eat. Longstreet would say to an artilleryman at that lunch that if they had their Virginia army here, the Yankees would have been whipped in half the time. Bragg called Longstreet to his headquarters, and the lieutenant general left the Brotherton farm. When the two men met, Longstreet requested troops from Polk's wing to help push the Federals off Snodgrass Hill. Bragg responded that no man in that wing would fight. Longstreet was astonished at this defeated mentality by Bragg. Longstreet returned to the front to coordinate further assaults, but the Federals would withdraw in the darkness. The next morning, Longstreet suggested the army pursue them north, cross the Tennessee River north of the city, and force Rosecrans to leave his fortifications. But the Army of Tennessee didn't have the transportation capabilities to make such a move, let alone the food needed to sustain them. Bragg wouldn't order a pursuit by the whole army until September 22nd. On September 22nd, McLaws' division led the Confederate infantry to Chattanooga, where Longstreet ordered him to attack the Union works. McLaws argued that he would incur a great amount of casualties and didn't have enough ambulances. This furthered the rift between Longstreet and McLaws. The Army of Tennessee settled in on the elevated terrain around Chattanooga and took stock of the battle days before. Major General John C. Breckinridge allegedly exclaimed as he rode by his cheering men that "Longstreet is the man, boys. Longstreet is the man." Newspapers circulated stories that Longstreet lifted up the spirits of the Army of Tennessee, stating, "Never in the war has any general been found who was superior to General Longstreet in the art of what is here called putting in his men." Lee would write 5 days after the battle to Longstreet, saying, "If it gives you as much pleasure to receive my warmest congratulations as it does me to convey them, this letter will not have been written in vain. My whole heart and soul have been with you and your brave corps in the late battle. It was natural to hear of Longstreet and Harvey Hill charging side by side, and pleasing to find the army of the East and West vying with each other in valor and devotion to their country. Finish the work before you, my dear General, and return to me." One of Longstreet's biographers claimed, "The orderliness and the mode of attack rank him as one of the preeminent combat generals of the war. Few officers of that rank grasped the realities of or situation on a battlefield better than Longstreet. He saw what would not work at Gettysburg and fashioned what would work at Chickamauga. He had advocated the strategic combination that brought him and his troops to Chickamauga, and then utilized his intellect and experience to formulate the tactical scheme that brought victory. It was the performance of a first-rate soldier, of a man who knew his trade." In the weeks after Chickamauga, Longstreet became embroiled in a scheme within the Army of Tennessee. Braxton Bragg was not liked by his subordinates, and he alienated many of them. Longstreet didn't think much of him as a commander or person, and Longstreet would be prominent in the attempt to oust Bragg from the command of the Army of Tennessee. Bragg's own chief of staff, whom the Army commander had known since West Point, stated, "He is very earnest at his work. His whole soul is in it, but his manner is repulsive, and he has no social life. He is easily flattered and fond of seeing reverence for his high position. If he don't want news to be true, he will listen to nothing. Frankly, I am afraid of his generalship. and would think the cause of the country far better placed in other hands. That he may have success I pray and wish, but he has not genius, and if our circumstances make this call upon him, he will fail in our hour of need. His mind is not fertile, nor his judgment good. On the night of September 22nd, Longstreet, Leonidas Polk, Daniel Harvey Hill, and Simon Bolivar Buckner met to discuss removing Bragg from command. Longstreet and Polk consented to write the authorities in Richmond and Robert E. Lee, arguing to remove Bragg from command and replace him with either Lee or Beauregard. The anti-Bragg coalition had fought the commander for months, but now they had a leader in Longstreet. He was the senior lieutenant general, and he was respected in the army and in Richmond. They hoped he would be listened to in the removal of Bragg. Longstreet wrote to Secretary of War James Seddon that, "To express my convictions in a few words, our chief has done but one thing that he ought to have done since I joined the army. That was to order the attack upon the 20th. All other things that he has done, he ought not to have done. I am convinced that nothing but the hand of God can save us or help us as long as we have our present commander." Longstreet even suggested that Lee be sent to command the Army of Tennessee. On October 4th, Longstreet, Hill, and Buckner prepared a petition to be signed by generals in the Army and be submitted to Jefferson Davis to remove Bragg. When the Army commander learned of the petition by the cabal of generals, he sent a telegram to Davis to intercede in the matter. Davis left Richmond on October 6th and arrived outside Chattanooga on October 9th. Davis met with Bragg first, then, with Bragg sitting in the corner of a room, brought many of the senior generals of the Army in and asked them to assess General Bragg. Longstreet reluctantly went first. He stated that Bragg was incompetent to lead the Army, and Buckner and Benjamin Cheatham agreed. Davis didn't expect such a statement with Bragg sitting in the room. After the meeting, Davis met with Longstreet and Buckner individually, since they were the two prominent leaders of the anti-Bragg group. On October 12th, Davis delivered a speech that reaffirmed his confidence in Bragg. The attempt to remove the Army commander had failed. As soon as the president left, Bragg began to take revenge on the generals who opposed him. He relieved D.H. Hill of command and reduced Buckner to divisional command, disbanding his Department of East Tennessee. Bragg would never forgive Longstreet. Bragg prepared for both an offensive operation against the Union Army garrison Chattanooga and a siege. He gave Longstreet the role of occupying Lookout Mountain and the all-important Lookout Valley, which housed one of the Union's best supply routes. Some of Longstreet's troops occupied the valley to put further strain on the Union garrison. In late October, Longstreet did receive great news: the birth of a son in Richmond. The child would be named Robert Lee Longstreet. Lookout Valley was held by the brigade of Evander Law. He placed his regiments to guard the valley and Brown's Ferry. However, when he took a leave of absence to visit his friend John Bell Hood, who was convalescent about 30 miles south of Chattanooga, his acting division commander Micah Jenkins withdrew 3 of his regiments from guarding the river and returned them to the east side of Lookout Mountain. To make matters worse for Longstreet and the Army of Tennessee, Ulysses S. Grant had arrived on the scene, replaced William S. Rosecrans with George Thomas to command the Army of the Cumberland, and began moving troops to Chattanooga to break the siege and open up a stable supply line. Cavalry and commanders warned Longstreet of an increase in Federal activity along the Tennessee River and Lookout Valley, but Longstreet didn't act on the reports or alert Bragg of the movements. When Law returned, he found 3 of his regiments no longer occupying Lookout Valley and began moving them back, but it would be too late. The Union attacked what Confederates were left in the valley and took control of the river crossing. Bragg rode to meet with Longstreet to discuss what Longstreet was going to do to combat the loss of ground. More Federal troops, those under Joseph Hooker, were arriving in the valley and were taking over the area. Bragg gave him permission to use multiple divisions, including William H.T. Walker's division, to accomplish the goal of driving the Federals from the valley, and also gave him permission to launch a night attack. Longstreet opted just to use Micah Jenkins's division, Hood's old division, to fight this battle. Although the Confederates had some success in the Battle of Wauhatchie, it ended in a defeat for the South and opened up a stable supply line for the Union soldiers at Chattanooga called the Cracker Line, for all of the hardtack crackers that moved across that route. However, one of the worst outcomes of the battle was the inner rivalry between the commanders in Jenkins' division. The brigadier generals in the division didn't like Jenkins, who Longstreet favored over all the other brigade commanders, and specifically requested the young man when he was sent to the Army of Tennessee. Evander Law believed that he should have been given division command, but Longstreet didn't care for Evander Law. Law and men like Jerome Robertson fought back against Jenkins's accusations of disobeying orders and dereliction of duty, but Longstreet would side with Jenkins in the rivalry. On November 3rd, Longstreet met with Bragg, William J. Hardee, and John C. Breckinridge to discuss dispatching Longstreet's troops for duty further north. Longstreet suggested moving his troops into Middle Tennessee to cut the supply lines of Grant, but all the other generals thought that was an impracticable move because of the logistics. So it was decided to send Longstreet north to Knoxville and eliminate Ambrose Burnside from the region. 2 days later, Longstreet began moving his troops along the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad toward the city of Knoxville. On November 5, 1863, Tyner Station, about 8 miles east of Chattanooga, bustled with Longstreet's troops as they made their way onto the train cars. However, the ravages of war had destroyed the railroad, and it would be November 7th before the cars got to moving, many of the men waiting on those cars nearly starving. The artillery and its gunners sat on flat cars and huddled together around one another to keep warm. Longstreet complained to Bragg that provisions were supposed to be provided for his men for the expedition, but nothing had been stockpiled for the journey. The troops made it to Sweetwater, Tennessee, still hungry and cold. Longstreet dispatched his staffers to wrangle up supplies wherever it could be had. Bragg was able to send Longstreet a number of wagons and animals with which to pull them, but as Longstreet's assistant quartermaster explained, the mules were barely strong enough to pull their own harnesses, let alone wagons full of supplies. Longstreet inched toward Knoxville, where Major General Ambrose Burnside, the former commander of the Army of the Potomac, occupied the city. Burnside had captured a large section of East Tennessee from Cumberland Gap to Knoxville in early September. He had orders from Ulysses S. Grant to delay Longstreet as he fell back to Knoxville. At Loudon, Micah Jenkins's division demonstrated along the Holston River downstream, while McLaws's division demonstrated upstream. A pontoon bridge was put together, and on the 14th of November, Jenkins's men marched to the other side of the river, encountering a little resistance. At Lenore Station, Burnside planned to put up some of his most stubborn resistance. His men had constructed a permanent camp in preparation of the attack. However, Burnside would pull his forces back before Longstreet could launch an attack. As they moved closer to Knoxville, McLaws became aware from a soldier who had resided in the area before the war that a road the gentleman knew of could get them in front of the Union columns and cut them off from Knoxville. He sent the information to Longstreet, but no reply came. McLaws also stated that he did not know even if the message got to Longstreet. Either way, McLaws felt that he missed a great opportunity to defeat Burnside early in the campaign. On November 16th, Longstreet got a fight out of Burnside at Campbell Station. However, as Confederate brigades of George Anderson and Evander Law were about to approach the flank of the Federal position, they were spotted and Burnside again withdrew, having only a minor engagement. As Longstreet pursued, Brigadier General Joseph Kershaw of McLaws's division, accompanied by a battery from Edward Porter Alexander's artillery, had a brisk and successful fight against a Union force under Brigadier General William Sanders. In the engagement, Sanders would be mortally wounded and die the next day in the Lamar Hotel in Knoxville. Sanders had been a close friend of Porter Alexander at West Point. Although he didn't have enough troops to completely invest the city, Longstreet did cut off major avenues in and out of the city. Ultimately, Longstreet wanted to attack before Burnside could receive reinforcements. A small attempt to attack the south side of the city failed, so he and his men began concentrating on a fort called Fort Loudon, but would be named Fort Sanders in honor of the fallen general. Longstreet made his headquarters at the Bleak House and planned the attack. One of Longstreet's biographers explained the formidableness of the fort. Fort Sanders had been constructed as an irregular quadrilateral, with salients at the northwest and southwest corners. The eastern front had been kept open to expedite the movement of troops into or out of the fort. Each of the three other sides had a steep parapet topped with cotton bales that were covered in rawhide to prevent their igniting from gunfire. A ditch that varied in width from 8 to 12 feet and in depth from 6 to 8 feet edged the base, creating a face of 20 feet in depth at numerous spots. In front of the ditch, the Federals had strung telegraph wires from tree stumps. A garrison of approximately 440 infantrymen and artillerymen with a dozen cannon manned Fort Sanders. Support came to Longstreet from Bragg in the form of Bushrod Johnson's division and Brigadier General Danville Ledbetter, the man who helped construct Knoxville's fortifications. Ledbetter and Longstreet studied Burnside's fortifications multiple times. Then they watched as a Union soldier passed through the ditch, and it was only waist high. The generals had debated the depth, but Longstreet's observance of that Union soldier convinced him to attack Fort Sanders from the northwest with McLaws's division. Jenkins's and Johnson's division, would give support. What Longstreet didn't know was that the soldier had crossed on a plank straddling the ditch. Rain delayed the attack that was meant for the 28th. As preparations were being made by McLaws, Jenkins was greatly concerned over the attack and vouched for McLaws's men to carry fascines or bundles of sticks to throw into the ditch in order to cross, or at the very least ladders with which to climb over the walls of the ford. He wrote Longstreet a quick note asking for these things, but Longstreet responded that the ditch wasn't more than 3 feet deep, and that if we go in with the idea that we shall fail, we will be sure to do so, but no men who are determined to succeed can fail. At the sound of 3 guns firing in rapid succession, the brigades of Bryan, Humphreys, and Wofford advanced and attacked the fort. Indeed, the ditch was much deeper than previously thought, and all 3 brigades were trapped in it, fighting for their lives as Union soldiers fired their muskets into the ditch, along with lighting artillery shells and casting them down the walls and into the ditch. When they realized the walls were too icy to climb without ladders, and there was no hope of succeeding, the men withdrew. The South lost 800 men in the ditch and the area surrounding Fort Sanders. The Union lost only 15. Within an hour after the attack failed, Longstreet received a telegram from President Davis stating that Bragg had been defeated at Chattanooga and for him to lift the siege of Knoxville and join Bragg in Georgia. Bragg wanted Longstreet to cross the mountains with his troops, but after consultation with his commanders, they decided that it could not be done. Longstreet's corps would withdraw east. On the night of December 4th, Longstreet's columns of Confederates began their march, passing through Blaine's Crossroads, Rutledge, Bean Station, and then to Rogersville, arriving there on December 9th. Union forces would pursue. Major General John G. Parke would lead the 9th and 23rd Corps, along with a cavalry division east. On December 12th, Burnside would request to be relieved of command, which was granted. Major General John G. Foster would take over command. Parke and the 2 corps pushed east after Longstreet, stopping his cavalry at Bean Station and the infantry a few miles west at Rutledge. On December 15th, Longstreet launched an assault with Bushrod Johnson's division against the Union cavalry. The Union soldiers used the buildings as cover, particularly a 3-story brick tavern. Longstreet sent his cavalry to fall into the Union rear to prevent them from escaping when he pushed them from the field, but his cavalry performed poorly this day. When Johnson was able to push the Federals out of Bean Station, Longstreet ordered McLaws to pursue them. McLaws objected, saying his men had had little food and could not be expected to attack. Micah Jenkins's division led the pursuit, but the Federals would withdraw to Blaine's Crossroads. Bean Station was a victory, but a fruitless one. On December 17th, Longstreet removed McLaws from command, citing a lack of confidence in executing plans. A joke circulated around the Confederacy defaming Longstreet, calling him Peter the Slow. One of Longstreet's biographers wrote, "Longstreet sensed the discontent with his generalship. The previous 3 months had exacted their price. The compelling characteristic of the man, his self-confidence, had deserted him. The glory of Chickamauga, which soldiers chanted Longstreet as the man, had been tarnished by the derisive joke, Peter the Slow." Longstreet was distraught over the last few months of his military career. Coming off a great victory at Chickamauga, he lost the Battle of Wauhatchie, and then his men got slaughtered at the Battle of Fort Sanders. He sat down and wrote a letter asking for himself to be replaced with a more capable commander. He felt he was of no use to the Confederacy in the independent command that he was currently in. To make matters worse for the general, he was also bringing charges against Lafayette McLaws, his longtime friend, for neglect of duty. He also brought charges against Jerome Robertson, commander of the Texas Brigade, for incompetency at the Battle of Bean Station. During that engagement, Robertson grew angry over his superiors and expressed himself, basically refusing to order his men into battle, but ultimately did. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, the Union troops had gotten away. The defeats on the battlefield and the infighting between his subordinates greatly depressed Longstreet. Secretary of War James Seddon agreed to replace Longstreet, but Davis wanted to hold off until they could find a worthy successor. The Confederate government also agreed to start a courts-martial for McLaws and Robertson. The courts-martial for Robertson took place after many delays on February 12, 1864, in Morristown, Tennessee. Simon Bolivar Buckner acted as president of the court. A number of brigadier generals made up the rest of the court, including James Kemper, who was still recovering from his wounds sustained at Gettysburg. The trial ended, and Robertson was replaced as commander of the Texas Brigade. He was sent to Richmond to await sentencing. but the charges were dismissed and he would be sent to Texas. McLaws' trial was to take place on February 13th, but Longstreet ordered Buckner to adjourn the trial for about a month until this next offensive was over. McLaws would be sent to Abingdon, Virginia, to await a summons to appear. McLaws would use all the time available to him to construct a defense against Longstreet's charges. He even found an ally in the Confederate government, Braxton Bragg, who had been sent to Richmond to counsel Jefferson Davis on military matters. Bragg wrote to McLaws that, "I can assure you that evidence in my possession is ample to convict Longstreet of disobedience of orders, neglect of duty, and want of cordial cooperation and support, which resulted in all the disasters after Chickamauga. This matter is worthy of your consideration." By mid-March, the court reconvened to try McLaws. He was charged with neglect of duty. The first specification cited the division commander for leaving the attack column unprotected by failing to place sharpshooters within good rifle range. The second specification alleged that he did not issue correct instructions to the force, and the third claimed that he directed the assault units toward the section of the fort where the ditch was impassable, and did not supply the troops with ladders or other means of crossing the barrier. The trial ended on March 19th. On May 5th, the findings were published. The court acquitted McLaws on the first two specifications, but found him guilty of the third specification, failing in the details of his attack to make arrangements essential to his success. He was suspended from rank and command, but the Confederate Inspector General overturned the verdict and sentence, citing irregularities in the proceedings that impacted the outcome. He was ordered back to the command of his division, but the War Department would transfer him to the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. He, like Robertson, was gone from the First Corps. That winter in East Tennessee, it was one of the worst winters on record nationally. Soldiers survived on very little food and supplies. Longstreet and his staff did their best to take care of the men, with Longstreet making repeated visits to hospitals to talk with and check on his soldiers. On one occasion, he even helped dress one of the patients. In early 1864, while Longstreet was preparing for the trials against Robertson and McLaws, he was campaigning against the Federals stationed in and around Knoxville. In mid-January, he got word of a major Union movement out of Knoxville toward Dandridge, Tennessee. He moved his force to that town and personally led a brigade in the small engagement that erupted, but the main Union body withdrew before a major battle could take place. Longstreet's staff and officers did find a flask of whiskey belonging to Union General Gordon Granger left in a house that acted as Union headquarters. Longstreet requested reinforcements, but Richmond could provide them with none, and instead took part of his cavalry command away from him, sending it to Joseph E. Johnston and the Army of Tennessee operating in northern Georgia. Ulysses S. Grant wanted an offensive against Longstreet to drive him further east. Longstreet, feeling the pressure, withdrew to Bull's Gap and fortified the gap, placing a strong picket line toward Russellville and keeping a large force at Greenville, Tennessee. On March 8th, Longstreet boarded a train and traveled to Lee's headquarters at Orange Courthouse, where they discussed a possible invasion of Kentucky, using his own troops, P.G.T. Beauregard with 20,000 men, and Johnston's Army of Tennessee. Lee thought the idea possible and told Longstreet to travel to Richmond and present it to the president. Longstreet knew that with Bragg in Richmond, any suggestion he made would be shot down, so he asked Lee to go along with him and submit the proposal as his own. Lee would not lie for Longstreet, but did go with him to Richmond. No record exists about what was discussed in the meeting, but Longstreet described it as non-conclusive. After the meeting, Longstreet traveled to Petersburg and stayed for 2 days with his wife and his 15-year-old son Garland and their infant son Robert Lee. Then he boarded a train for Tennessee. Once he returned to his corps, he began making preparations for his men to rejoin the Army of Northern Virginia. He also needed to permanently reorganize the corps by permanently replacing John Bell Hood after he was promoted to corps command in the Army of Tennessee and replaced McLaws. Longstreet wanted Micah Jenkins to take command of Hood's old division, and Joseph Kershaw to take McLaws's place. However, President Davis wanted to give Hood's old division to Major General Charles Field. Field had commanded a brigade in A.P. Hill's Light Division until being seriously wounded at 2nd Manassas. Davis assigned him to Hood's division and Kershaw, as requested by Longstreet, to McLaws's division. This did not sit well with Longstreet, who protested the placing of Field in command of the division. He even asked that Field take McLaws's division, while Jenkins took Hood's division. His scathing letter to the President and the Secretary of War asking why this change was made to the command structure garnered animosity from the President that threatened Longstreet with insubordination. That was not the only command problem in Longstreet's corps. Evander Law also coveted division command, but refused to remain subordinate to Micah Jenkins. In December 1863, Law offered his resignation and wanted a transfer to the cavalry. He asked for a leave of absence to present the letter to the Confederate government in Richmond, which Longstreet agreed to. Once he arrived in Richmond, on the advice of his friend John Bell Hood, Law let Hood present the letter to the Secretary of War, which he did but did not submit. Afterward, Hood convinced Law to reconsider and destroy the letter. Since he had not officially resigned or submitted his resignation, Law returned to Tennessee to take command of his brigade once again. Longstreet, seeing Law, fumed with anger. Not only did he believe that Law requested leave under false pretenses, but he had heard rumors that Law's Alabama brigade sought service in their native state, and Law's trip to Richmond was an effort to get them the transfer. Longstreet had Law arrested. Meanwhile, Longstreet's corps was transferred back to the Army of Northern Virginia. The Inspector General ordered Law restored to command. In Virginia, Longstreet had Law rearrested and told Lee in a harsh letter that if Law was not put on trial, he himself would like to be relieved of command. Lee worked with Longstreet to relieve Law of duty until an investigation could be done, but President Davis restored him to command and transferred him to the cavalry. Longstreet and Lee were now reunited in Northern Virginia and preparing to confront Longstreet's good friend Ulysses S. Grant in what would become known as the Overland Campaign. On May 1, 1864, Longstreet attended services at the Episcopal Church at Orange Courthouse, along with Lee and other generals. Longstreet was confirmed a member of the church on that day as well. On May 2nd, Robert E. Lee met with his corps commanders, Longstreet, Richard Ewell, and A.P. Hill atop Clark's Mountain. The Army commander told his subordinates that he believed the Union Army would move against their right flank. By May 4th, the Confederate scouts and signalmen could see the roads jammed with infantry, cavalry, and artillery as the mammoth Union Army began maneuvering. Ewell and Hill's corps were closest to the Union movement, so Lee dispatched Ewell along the Orange Turnpike and Hill along the Orange Plank Road to engage the Union Army of the Potomac in the tangled brush and forest of the Wilderness. Lee initially ordered Longstreet to follow behind Hill on the Orange Plank Road, but Longstreet thought a better route would allow him to approach the Union left flank and rear, hopefully stopping their movement and maybe sending them back across the river. Lee gave consent, but as the fighting brought the two sides into a bloody stalemate on May 5th, Lee needed Longstreet to come up behind Hill. Between midnight and 1 a.m. on May 6th, Longstreet began his march to support Hill. Charles Field's division led the column. A mistake from one of their guides cost the division time, but Joseph Kershaw's division was close at hand. It was daylight, and Longstreet could hear the sound of battle in the distance. They were roughly 3 miles away from the fighting. As Longstreet's divisions maneuvered their way along the Orange Plank Road, Hill's corps was surprised by a Union attack early that morning. Lee witnessed the troops streaming back through the woods toward the Whittletap Farm, where a significant amount of artillery was placed. Seeing General McGowan and his troops, Lee exclaimed, "My God, General McGowan, is this fine brigade of yours fleeing like wild geese?" McGowan responded, "Sir, my men are not beaten. They want only a place to reform and fight." Lee dispatched aides to hurry Longstreet and his troops along. They found him a half-mile from the battlefield, and the columns began to quicken their pace. Moxley Sorrell wrote, "I have always thought that the forming line in the dense brush under fire of the enemy amid the routed men of A.P. Hill and the beating of the enemy under these circumstances was the steadiest and finest thing the Corps ever did. To their chief was due that steadiness as always." The Texas Brigade was one of the first units to make it to the field. Lee could be seen by the Texans in their front, and they began to yell, "Go back, General Lee. We will not go on if you don't go back." Lee then moved across the Plank Road and met with Longstreet. After a brief discussion, the old warhorse rode to oversee his attack in columns. In the words of Edward Porter Alexander, the Confederate infantry hit like a whirlwind when they reached the field, pushing back the Federal attackers. One of Tom Gorey's brothers was laying amongst a group of wounded soldiers as Longstreet and his aides passed by. When Longstreet saw how distraught his staffer was, tears could be seen in the general's eyes. Longstreet's push against the Federals was unconventional, but highly effective. He used his first line in the role of skirmishers, but formed a heavy skirmish line so that the men could fire continuously into the blue lines and evade bullets by not having to stand in a shoulder-to-shoulder formation. Behind the heavy skirmishers was the second line, a well-supported formation of brigades ready to take advantage of the damage caused by the heavy skirmishers. During the fight, Lee dispatched his chief engineer, Martin L. Smith, to Longstreet. Longstreet sent him on a mission to go south of the Orange Plank Road to find an unfinished railroad cut and scout for a route around the Union left flank. Longstreet then readied an attack force for such a maneuver. 3 brigades were found available for the attack, those under George Anderson, William Wofford, and William Mahone. Once Smith finished scouting, Longstreet sent Sorrell with the 3 brigades to the location for an attack against the Union flank. He told Sorrell, "Hit hard when you start, but don't start until you have everything ready. I shall be waiting for your gunfire and be on hand with fresh troops for further advance." Longstreet's flanking movement did exactly what he wanted it to. It rolled up the Union line like a scroll, in the words of Alexander. The Union line crumbled and began pulling back. Only pockets of resistance remained in his front. The Confederate attackers halted just south of the Orange Plank Road to reform, except for the 12th Virginia, who continued on. Longstreet planned to do the same maneuver again and took off down the Orange Plank Road. The 12th Virginia realized they were alone and isolated, so they began their march back to the road. Their comrades mistook them for the enemy and delivered a volley. At the same time, Longstreet, Moxley Sorrell, Charles Field, Joseph Kershaw, Micah Jenkins, and staff members were riding on the road. The volley was deadly, killing a member of Kershaw's staff and his orderly. A bullet hit Micah Jenkins in the skull. A round passed through Longstreet's shoulder and struck him in the neck. Sorrell remembered that the bullet lifted Longstreet straight up and came down hard on his saddle. Sorrell, Peyton Manning, and Francis Dawson helped the general down from his saddle and laid him against a tree. Blood began to well up in his mouth, but he was able to communicate to Sorrell to report the wounding to Lee. He handed command of the corps to Charles Field and told him of the plan for the attack. Once the blood was stopped, the aides put Longstreet on a stretcher. To keep the troops from finding out that the general was wounded, they covered his face with his hat, but the soldiers knew their general's body, and with his face covered, a rumor spread that the general was dead. When some soldiers began to shout that he was dead as the body passed, Longstreet used his left hand to raise the hat from his face. When he did, the soldiers gave a cheer. An artilleryman remembered the scene. "I never on any occasion during the 4 years of the war saw a group of officers and gentlemen more deeply distressed. They were literally bowed down with grief, all of them in tears. It was not alone the general they admired who had been shot down, it was rather the man they loved." The general was loaded onto an ambulance and taken from the field. Just a year earlier, nearly to the day, Lee had lost Stonewall Jackson to friendly fire not very far from the spot Longstreet was hit. The flank attack Longstreet explained to Field was postponed, not by Field, but by Lee. Lee saw the entangled mess that the battle lines were in and ordered Field to put them into a parallel line. As one of Longstreet's biographers explained, in the most difficult of terrain, Longstreet modified his tactical formations, salvaged the army from disaster, routed one enemy line with a rapidly conceived and executed flank attack, and was preparing a final offensive when misfortune denied him. His performance was brilliant, a confirmation of his consummate ability as a tactician. He first traveled to Orange Courthouse, then to Charlottesville. While there, the wife of a staff member remembered, "He is very feeble and nervous, and suffers much from his wound. He sheds tears on the slightest provocation and apologizes for it. He says he does not see why a bullet going through a man's shoulder should make a baby of him." He then went to Lynchburg to a hospital there, but was moved to Lotus Grove, the residence of a Confederate colonel, when a Union army under David Hunter came near the town. On June 14th, Federal cavalry passed by Lotus Grove, not knowing that one of the Confederacy's most famous generals occupied a room in the house. Louise and the children came to stay with him during his recovery. By mid-June, Longstreet telegraphed the War Department that the wound was healing, but his arm still remained paralyzed. He requested permission to travel to Georgia to visit friends, which he was granted. By July, the family was heading south. The Longstreets would spend the summer around Augusta and Athens, Georgia, staying with family and visiting friends. Despite his leave, he still communicated with Robert E. Lee. In one letter, Lee wrote, "You will soon be as well as ever, and we shall all be rejoiced at your return. You must not, however, be over impatient at the gradual progress you must necessarily make, but be content with the steady advance you are making to health and strength. Your programs will be more certain and your recovery more confirmed. Do not let Sherman capture you, and I will endeavor to hold Grant till you come. Our enemy is very cautious, and he has become so proficient in entrenching that he seems to march with a system already prepared." By mid-September, Longstreet boarded a train for Richmond, and Louise and the children traveled to Lynchburg. The general still didn't have use of his right arm, and carried it in a sling. He also couldn't ride his horse. However, by the end of the month, he was able to mount his new horse, Fly by Night, a gift sent to him by General Lee while he was in Georgia. Longstreet would officially take command of his First Corps on October 19th. As he rode by his troops, the men all along the entrenchments began to cheer, referring to him as the Old Bull of the Woods. A party was held in the general's honor, welcoming him back to the ranks. When Longstreet returned, he dealt with a lot of personnel changes to his staff. Many men were transferred to other generals or transferred out of the state, but the worst loss to Longstreet was Moxley Sorrell. The young man was promoted to brigadier general and given command of a brigade in A.P. Hill's corps. As Longstreet settled into his duties as commander of the First Corps, he basically commanded all forces north of the James River in the defense of Richmond and Petersburg. Ulysses S. Grant continued to extend his lines west and south to cut the Confederate Army off from the rest of the Confederacy and deny it much-needed supplies and what reinforcements could be had. Aside from an offensive operation at the end of October, both armies remained in their entrenchments, and sharpshooters played havoc on the poor soldiers who dared to peer over the parapets. Longstreet remained at his headquarters, nursing his partially paralyzed arm and dealing with the hemorrhaging of soldiers from the ranks. On New Year's Day, he wrote to Lee, "I believe that we are now better able to cope with Grant now than we ever have been, if we will profit by our experience and exert ourselves properly in improving our organizations." A month later, he wrote to Lee that he could not hold his line with the amount of men that he possessed, but added, "We shall fight him, of course, as long as we have a man, but we should fight with much better heart if we could have hope of results." In these last few months of the siege of Richmond and Petersburg, debate swirled about the merits of authorizing the use of slaves as soldiers with the pledge of freedom for their service. Lee asked Longstreet's opinion, but the lieutenant general opposed the idea because it would mean the necessity of abolishing slavery in the future without materially aiding us in the present. However, he did ask Ewell to raise a company of slaves in Richmond to be tested as soldiers. Despite their effort, Lee was already drawing up retreat routes from Richmond and Petersburg. At the end of February, a letter came through the lines from Union Major General Edward Ord, wanting to meet with Longstreet and discuss prisoners of war and fraternization between their troops. The two generals met, but during their meeting, Ord requested a side interview. Ord stated that since the politicians had failed to bring an end to the hostilities, it was up to the Army officers. Ord was referring to the meeting between Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens and United States President Abraham Lincoln aboard the River Queen at Hampton Roads that failed in its mission. Ord wanted a suspension of hostilities, for Lee and Grant to meet, and an exchange of visits between Louise Longstreet and Julia Grant, two old friends. Longstreet explained that he had no authority to do so, but would mention it to Lee. That night, Longstreet, Lee, Davis, and John C. Breckinridge discussed what Ord had put forward, and they seemed receptive. Longstreet met with Ord a second time, and it was decided for Lee to communicate with Grant. On March 2nd, Lee wrote a letter offering to meet with Grant and discuss the end of the war. Grant wrote back that he didn't have the authority to discuss political matters, that was the purview of the President of the United States. His matters were simply military. On March 25th, Lee launched his last offensive with an attack on Fort Stedman. Although the Confederates gained some moderate success in the beginning of the attack, the lack of troops and Union reinforcements rushing to the area prevented the rebels from succeeding. On April 1st, Longstreet's friend George Pickett was embarrassed at the Battle of Five Forks when his division was routed while he attended a shad bake. The grip of Ulysses S. Grant was tightening around the Confederacy, and it was only a matter of time before it would gasp its final breath. With the defeat at Five Forks, Lee telegraphed Longstreet to come at once with Field's division to Petersburg. Longstreet moved immediately, pulling his troops out of their defenses and instructing General Ewell to fill the vacant entrenchments with local defensive troops. Longstreet and the division crossed the James River on a pontoon bridge and arrived at Lee's headquarters on April 2nd at daylight. Lee was unwell when Longstreet entered the home that acted as the commanding general's headquarters. A.P. Hill was also there, getting instructions from Lee. The commander was unwell as he explained how he would secure the lines to the southwest, but as they talked, the roar of musketry could be heard in the distance. word came to the three generals that the far right of their line was being attacked and driven in. Hill rode off in the direction of the sounds of battle to shore up his lines and restore order to the chaos that was the Confederate lines. As Longstreet examined the lines, one of Hill's aides came to him with word that Hill had been killed. Later that day, Lee telegraphed Jefferson Davis in Richmond that I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here until night. I am not certain that I can do that. Miraculously, Lee's troops held on until night. The Confederate government, including the President, boarded trains out of the city, and much of Richmond was set ablaze. Longstreet formed up his 1st Corps and that of the 3rd Corps since A.P. Hill had been killed, and began their march west, out of the confines of the fortifications that had been their home since June of the previous year. The capital was burning, and the prospects of victory looked dim as Longstreet and his troops marched along the roads leaving the city. The Army of Northern Virginia marched along the roads leaving Richmond. As usual, Longstreet and Lee rode together most of the time, Lee always seeking the advice of Longstreet. When the army first stopped for a rest and to eat, the two generals shared a meal with a family along the road. Their hosts talked confidently of victory still. Longstreet didn't respond to the comment, but Lee stated, "Whatever happens, know this, that no men ever fought better than those who have stood by me." On April 4th, the Army crossed the Appomattox River and made their way to Amelia Courthouse, expecting to find a cache of supplies, but they found none. Foraging parties then spread out along the countryside to gather any foodstuffs available. The foraging would cost the Army a valuable day of movement. Grant was close at hand, marching by parallel routes toward the beleaguered Confederates. Longstreet deployed the divisions Charles Field and Cadmus Wilcox to protect the wagon train as the foraging continued. The lost day allowed for the Union Army to close in on Lee, blocking his route to Jetersville and forcing Longstreet's lead columns to march northward toward Farmville. The hard-fighting Longstreet positioned his troops in line of battle at Rice's Station, awaiting the troops of Richard Ewell, who was to join them soon. Longstreet waited throughout April 6 with Lee impatiently awaiting word of Ewell's arrival. Word came that Ewell's command had been attacked at Sailor's Creek. Lee rode with William Mahone and his division to the site of battle, and overlooking the bluff could see Confederate troops streaming back. He commented to William Mahone, "My God, has the army dissolved?" Generals Ewell, Kershaw, and Custis Lee, Lee's son, was captured in the engagement. At about 10 p.m., Longstreet pulled his troops away from Rice's Station and marched toward Farmville, recrossing the Appomattox River. A group of officers, led by Brigadier General William Pendleton, the Army's artillery commander, approached Longstreet about surrendering and wanted Longstreet to approach Lee with the idea, knowing he held the confidence of Lee. Longstreet responded that he was there to support Lee, not pull him down, and that he believed the men could still whoop 4 times their number, and as long as that was true, he would not propose surrender. As Longstreet and Lee rested near the lines, a courier approached with a letter from Grant asking for the surrender of the army. It read in part, "The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle." After Lee read the letter, he handed it to Longstreet. Lee's old warhorse read the letter from his old friend and then handed it back to Lee and said, "Not yet." Lee then wrote a letter back to Grant without conferring with anyone. In it, he dismissed Grant's assertion that the fight was hopeless, but did ask for terms. He showed the letter to no one, sealed it, then gave it to a courier. Longstreet remembered a moment on the retreat that illustrated the strain put on Lee. "One evening after dark, as we rode, we stopped at a little fire that someone had started and left. While a number were hovering about it, General Lee, standing near, leaning against a small tree, passed off into slumber, and seemed so rigid I had to look a second time to see if he had not passed into his last sleep. He was so troubled all of the march that he had little rest, I may say no rest, though nature demanded a little quiet." Longstreet and Lee again began their movement, this time toward Lynchburg. The army stopped just east of the community of Appomattox Courthouse, along the Richmond-Lynchburg stage road. Lee hoped to gather supplies at Appomattox Station, but Federal cavalry under George Armstrong Custer seized the supply cars, and Federal infantry were forced marching to cut Lee and Longstreet off. It was April 8th, and Grant had sent another letter to Lee about a possible surrender. Lee agreed to meet with Grant at 10 o'clock the next morning. However, Lee thought it was only cavalry in his front and that they may be able to break out, so he dispatched John B. Gordon and his corps to clear the way for the rest of the army. At dawn on April 9th, Gordon's corps attacked Federal cavalry. When the cavalry fell back, Union infantry took their place, sealing the fate of the Army of Northern Virginia. When Lee was informed of this, he stated, "Then there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Some accounts conflict on what happened next to Longstreet, but one account tells of Custer riding through Confederate lines with a flag of truce and was escorted to Longstreet. There, Custer stated, "In the name of General Sheridan, I demand the unconditional surrender of this army." Longstreet glared at the young man, saying nothing and forcing Custer to repeat his words. When he did, Longstreet responded, "I am not the commander of this army, and if I were, I would not surrender it to General Sheridan." Custer was then escorted out of Confederate lines. Longstreet then ordered Porter Alexander to prepare a battle line of Mahone and Wilcox's division to support Gordon. It would be the last battle line the Army of Northern Virginia formed. Alexander said that he remembered every detail of it. That morning, Longstreet met with other Confederate and some Union generals in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. Then, as he returned to Confederate lines, he met Lee in a small apple orchard. The two spoke for a few moments. Lee worried that Grant would demand harsh terms. Longstreet assured him that Grant would be fair, but as Lee started to leave, Longstreet told him, "General, if he does not give us good terms, come back and let us fight it out." That would be Longstreet's last counsel with General Lee. Lee would surrender the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean. The troops would lay down their arms and then go home after being paroled. Once the surrender terms were signed, Lee rode back into Confederate lines where he was met with cheers from his soldiers, who offered to keep on fighting when he informed them that they had been surrendered. Longstreet, Gordon, and Pendleton rode into Appomattox Courthouse as the commissioners appointed by Lee. As they rode to the McLean house, Grant spotted Longstreet. After he dismounted, Grant walked up to his old friend, grabbed him by the hands, and then embraced him. The Union commander offered Lee's old warhorse a cigar, and then jokingly said, "Pete, let us have another game of brag to recall the old days which were so pleasant to us all." After visiting for only a short time, Grant departed, and Longstreet helped prepare the troops and paroles. On the night of April 11th to the morning of the 12th, Lee and Longstreet shared their last campsite together. On the 12th, Lee would leave for Richmond, but that morning the generals met at Lee's headquarters to say their final farewells. Lee warmly embraced Longstreet and told him goodbye, then turned to Tom Gorey, who stood next to Longstreet, and said, "Captain, I'm going to put my old war horse under your charge. I want you to take good care of him." Lee rode off, never to see his old war horse again. Longstreet would depart later that day. He left with the thought that he may settle in Texas and start his new life there as a civilian, something he had not been in 27 years. Longstreet and Gorey traveled to Lynchburg to join Louisa and the children there. They remained at the Virginia town until June. On May 31st, Louise gave birth to their 8th child, a boy that they named James Jr. Their 4th son had also been named James Jr., but he had passed away on January 26, 1862 from scarlet fever. Longstreet, his son Garland, Tom Gorey, and a servant named Jim started south on June 28th, passing through the Carolinas. Longstreet rode in an ambulance driven by Jim. They stayed at homes along the way that could make room for the travelers, and their host provided them with what food they could. By mid-July, the party arrived at Longstreet's brother's home in Cleveland, Georgia. When they continued on their journey on July 31st, Longstreet's brother William joined them. Soon after leaving William's home, Tom Gorey left the group and headed straight for Texas. The group traveled to Canton, Mississippi, where James and William's sister Sarah lived with her husband, Judge Charles Ames. While in Mississippi, Longstreet, quote, discharged his family servants, then headed south to Mobile, Alabama, where the party got on a steamer to New Orleans. The South's largest city offered opportunities, and many Confederates relocated there, including John Bell Hood, Simon Bolivar Buckner, John Magruder, and Cadmus Wilcox. 2 former members of the Washington Artillery, Edward and William Owen, returned to New Orleans after their time in the war and started a cotton brokerage firm and asked Longstreet to join them as a partner. Longstreet accepted the offer. At the end of October, Longstreet went back to Lynchburg by train. While there, he put in his application for a pardon from the United States government, as described in President Andrew Johnson's proclamation on May 29th. Longstreet traveled to Washington, D.C., met with his old friend, General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant, and the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and Grant agreed to write a letter to Johnson on Longstreet's behalf for a pardon. When Longstreet met with Johnson asking for a pardon, the president refused, saying, "There are 3 persons of the South who can never receive amnesty: Mr. Davis, General Lee, and yourself. You have given the Union cause too much trouble." Longstreet was now void of political rights. The Longstreets made it to New Orleans by Christmas, and on New Year's Day 1866, the cotton brokerage firm of Longstreet, Owen & Company opened its office at 37 Union Street. Longstreet wrote to his old commander, Robert E. Lee, telling him of his business and including his business card. Lee would write back saying, "I know you will do your work well, wishing you all happiness and prosperity." Longstreet spent much of 1866 traveling around Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana procuring cotton for the firm. He even wrote to Gorey that he would give him $1 commission on every good bale of cotton he could procure from Texas. Louise, Robert Lee, and James Jr. stayed in New Orleans on these long trips. Garland, the oldest, began attending the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Longstreet expanded his economic reach by becoming the president of the Great Southern and Western Fire, Marine, and Accident Insurance Company and the Southern Hospital Association. During the years right after the end of the Civil War, he attempted to expand into the railroad business, but his ventures in that type of industry didn't yield him any additional income. The end of the Civil War brought heated debate in Washington, D.C. and over the whole country about how to deal with ex-Confederates and how to secure rights for African Americans in the South. In March 1867, Congress passed Reconstruction Acts that divided the former Confederacy into military districts and forced the states to write up a new constitution guaranteeing African American civil rights. Since the end of the war, Longstreet both publicly and privately advocated for moderation, forbearance, and submission. When a New Orleans newspaper asked for his response to the new legislation, he responded with a letter. "We are a conquered people," Longstreet wrote. "Southerners must recognize this fact fairly and squarely, with but one course left for wise men to pursue, and that is to accept the terms that are now offered by the conquerors. If the constitutional government shall be reestablished, the only course of action for Southerners is to comply with the requirements of the recent congressional legislation." He dismissed the idea that the representative men of a great nation could make such a pledge of membership in Congress in bad faith. He concluded, "Let us accept terms as we are in duty bound to do, and if there is a lack of good faith, let it be upon others." Republicans praised Longstreet's view, and in May 1867, Longstreet attended a meeting where Pennsylvania Congressman W.D. Pig Iron Kelly and Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson argued for compliance with the acts. This only fanned the flames of discontent with the acts, and the legislature denounced them, sparking political unrest. In a private letter, he explained his views. "My politics is to save the little that is left of us, and go to work to improve that little as best as we may. As to black suffrage," he argued, "it is all important that we should exercise such influence over that vote as to prevent it being injurious to us, and we can only do that as Republicans. As there is no principle or issue now that should keep us from the Republican Party, it seems to me that our duty to ourselves and to all our friends requires that our party, South, should seek an alliance with the Republican Party. If the whites won't do this, the thing will be done by the blacks, and we shall be set aside if not expatriated. It then seems plain to me that we should do the work ourselves, and have it white instead of black, and have our best men in public office." When the idea of violence came up as a way to challenge the political landscape, he stated, "I think that the time has come for peace, and I am not willing to lose more blood or means in procuring it. If there are any in the country inclined to fight the question, I hope not to be included in that number. I shall not abuse them for their views, and I hope that they will not deny me the right to withdraw from the contest." Longstreet wanted to make a public vow of cooperation with the Republicans. His business partner, William Owen, advised against it. John Bell Hood read the letter and stated, "They will crucify you," and his uncle Augustus said, "It will ruin you, son, if you publish it." Longstreet was undeterred by his friends' comments. Generally, Northern newspapers praised the expression of cooperation. Southerners balked at the idea of cooperating with the political party, which had prosecuted the war against them and advocated for civil rights for African Americans. Most newspapers glossed over Longstreet's insistence that by linking up with the Republican Party that they can control the black vote, except for the black newspapers who saw this statement as an indication that former Confederates may use the Republican Party to suppress their vote. The South began to label him a traitor, But Longstreet didn't understand the reaction, as he later wrote to Tom Gorey, "I was anxious to keep the South out of the troubles that she has passed through since, and that was about the extent of my interest in the affairs of the state. For my pains I had nothing of good from them, or even appreciative expressions of sentiment." Longstreet hadn't expected such anger and vitriol from his friends, associates, and business because of his statements toward and for the Republican Party. It would be the threats to himself and his family, as well as a yellow fever and cholera outbreak, that led him to move his family to Lynchburg, Virginia. He would return periodically to New Orleans, but wouldn't stay long. Being in Virginia, he often visited Washington, D.C., and his friend Ulysses S. Grant located there. In June 1868, Congress enacted a law restoring the political rights of many former Confederate officers. Longstreet was included in that number. He campaigned for Grant in his presidential bid and attended the inauguration. Grant nominated Longstreet for the position of Surveyor of Customs for the Port of New Orleans, with an annual $6,000 salary. Longstreet would travel to the Crescent City and arrive there by the middle of April 1869. One of his biographers explained the situation. Although he needed a job and income, many white Southerners thought that Longstreet had committed an unpardonable sin. It was one thing to endorse support for Republican Party policies. It was altogether another matter to hold a government position and participate in the Republican rule in the South. Newspapers immediately accused Longstreet of putting self-interest over principle. He was called a scalawag, a Southerner who betrayed his native region for power and money doled out by Republicans. His old friend, West Point classmate, and fellow General Harvey Hill typified the reaction to Longstreet's appointment when he wrote in a newspaper, "Our scalawag is the local leper of the community. Unlike the carpetbagger, a Northerner, Longstreet is a native, which is so much the worse." Lost cause myth had already begun to coalesce by this point in Reconstruction. The myth that the South never stood a chance of winning the war made those who were alive into heroes and those that died during the conflict martyrs. Longstreet had committed an unforgivable sin. As one biographer put it, to join the Republicans, the political instrument of conquest and defeat, was to betray those who had died for the cause and those who were living under an imposed rule by the conquerors. When Longstreet and his family returned to New Orleans, they were ostracized by the community, while being accepted and supported by the white Republicans of the city. In May 1870, the governor of Louisiana, Henry C. Warmoth, a Union veteran, appointed Longstreet the adjutant general of the 5,000-man state militia made up of white and black militiamen. The next month, he became the president of the New Orleans and Northeastern Railroad. Altogether, with his 3 jobs, he was making between $10,000 and $15,000 a year, quite a sum for the time. 2 years later, during some political infighting, where the Republican Party split between the governor and the Customs House faction, Longstreet took the governor's side and resigned from his Customs House position and as adjutant general. The election saw claims of fraud resulting in both the Customs House Republicans and the Democrats claiming victory. After Warmoth was impeached, President Grant recognized the Republican candidate, William H. Kellogg, as a legitimate governor. Longstreet assumed command of the militia and the New Orleans Metropolitan Police Force, and on Inauguration Night, his troops, along with federal soldiers, stopped the Democratic supporters from taking over the police stations. The next day, Longstreet's policemen occupied the International Order of Oddfellows Hall, the headquarters of the Democratic Party, and arrested everyone who was in there. They would soon be released by order of the governor. In response to losing the governorship and believing that they had indeed won it to begin with, the White Democrats of New Orleans formed the Crescent City White League, a paramilitary organization made up of former Confederates. When 6 Republican office holders were killed, it was thought to be the work of the White League. The governor declared martial law, and it was occupied by federal troops, along with Longstreet's police force. When the police found weapons smuggled into the city in boxes labeled machinery and addressed to the White League, the situation exploded. On the evening of September 14th, 8,400 armed White League members advanced on the State House in what would become known as the Battle of Liberty Place. Awaiting them was Longstreet, commanding 3,600 policemen and black militiamen, along with 2 Gatling guns and a battery of artillery. Longstreet rode out from his battle line and ordered the group to disperse. The White Leaguers pulled him down from his horse and opened fire. A battle ensued, with Longstreet being hit with a spent bullet and taken as a prisoner by the White Leaguers. The rebels pushed the militia and the police from the State House and took control of it. During the battle, 38 men were killed and 78 men were wounded. Grant would use federal troops to restore order and free Longstreet. In the coming elections, Democrats would take over the government in Louisiana, and the Republican rule ended. Longstreet's role in the battle with the White Leaguers made white Southerners hate him even more. He had led black troops against Confederate veterans. He would be relieved of duty with the militia following the battle. Longstreet's health caused the former general to relocate himself and his family to Georgia, not to mention the possibility of danger lurking in New Orleans because of his actions and rhetoric. The family had grown by the time it moved. A son named Fitz Randolph and a girl named Maria Louisa joined the family in 1869 and 1872 respectively. Longstreet's shoulder and arm still hurt him, still having no use of his right arm, and he suffered from rheumatism. His brother William, who lived in Gainesville, Georgia, convinced him to move to that area, which he did in the summer of 1875. He would purchase the Piedmont Hotel in town and buy land to build a farmhouse about 2 or 3 miles outside of town. Longstreet supported Rutherford B. Hayes for president, and when Hayes got elected, he vied for a position, particularly collector of customs in New Orleans and U.S. Marshal for Georgia, but those failed. He made frequent trips to New Orleans since he still remained on the board of directors for city schools and administrator for the University of Louisiana, now Tulane University. In March 1877, he committed another sin in the white Southerners' minds. He converted to Catholicism, an egregious offense to the predominantly Protestant South. In January 1879, Longstreet would be appointed postmaster of Gainesville from the Hayes administration. The position allowed him to flirt with Georgia politics, but his political sense, as proven in Louisiana, was not up to par, and he stumbled through the political landscape. In 1880, Hayes appointed him the United States Minister to Turkey. By mid-December 1880, he was in Constantinople. Louise and the children would stay in Gainesville. Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan II welcomed the former Confederate general to the country, but Longstreet was ill-suited for the role. However, he did secure permission from Khan for American archaeologists to do research in Turkey, which was a reversal for the Sultan. That would pretty much be his only accomplishment. Just 3 months after his arrival, Longstreet requested and received a 60-day leave to tour Western Europe, during which he traveled to Austria, Prussia, and France. When he returned to Turkey, the United States government recalled him, and he would be made the U.S. Marshal for Georgia. Longstreet's predecessor had been part of fraud and wrongdoing. Not wanting the problems from the former Marshal to come back on him, he requested an audit. The House of Representatives appointed an investigator, and he found fraud on the books and found that one of the deputies that Longstreet had retained from the former Marshal was still committing crimes. The investigator advocated for an investigation by the Department of Justice, but the department refused to launch an investigation. The investigator also claimed that Longstreet was incompetent in his role as Marshal, so Longstreet wrote letters defending himself and even went before the House committee defending himself and his son Garland, who Longstreet had appointed Chief Deputy Marshal. Both were accused of incompetence. Through political dealings, some Georgia Republicans convinced President Chester A. Arthur to get rid of Longstreet, which he did by requesting his resignation. With the election of the first Democrat to the presidency in over 20 years in the form of Grover Cleveland in 1884, Longstreet knew that his political appointments would be over as long as the Democrats stayed in charge. He would go into semi-retirement in Gainesville. The semi-retirement that Longstreet went into became a pleasurable time for the old general. He enjoyed being a farmer, raising turkeys, planting an orchard, and tending to a vineyard from which he made wine that he sold. Occasionally, some rambunctious Georgia boys from around the neighborhood would sneak into the vineyard and help themselves to some grapes. Lee's old warhorse would discover the young boys and fire an old musket into the air to scare them off. He described this time on his farm as one of the delights of his life. Gainesville residents could find the now gray-haired veteran nurturing and pruning the trees in his orchard or relaxing at his farmhouse. In 1888, a grand reunion was held at Gettysburg for the 25th anniversary of the battle. Among the invited guests were Union Corps commanders Henry Slocum and Daniel Sickles, as well as other prominent Union officers like Joshua Chamberlain and Daniel Butterfield. But it wasn't only Union soldiers at this event. Many ex-Confederates returned to that small Pennsylvania town. Among those veterans was James Longstreet. Longstreet became a celebrity during the celebrations, with onlookers and veterans scrambling to get a glimpse or speak to the former Confederate general. He was now 67 years old. His dark hair had turned gray, and his famous long beard was now in the style of Ambrose Burnside's famous facial hair. Longstreet attended the dedication of monuments to the Iron Brigade in and around Herbst Woods. There he spoke with Brevet Brigadier General Rufus Dawes, who, along with his regiment, the 6th Wisconsin, charged into the unfinished railroad cut near the Chambersburg Pike and captured many soldiers belonging to Joseph Davis's Confederate brigade. During their encounter, Dawes said to Longstreet, "General, it looks very different from the scene of 25 years ago." Longstreet responded, "Yes, it reminds me of a camp meeting." Another Union veteran made the comment to Longstreet that if Lee had listened to the old warhorse, that the Battle of Gettysburg may have been vastly different. Then he asked the aging general if he had been dead set against Pickett's charge. Longstreet responded with only one word: "Yes." That evening, Longstreet had dinner with his rival on the second day at Gettysburg, Union 3rd Corps Commander Daniel Sickles. Sickles had lost a leg to Longstreet's artillery on that fateful day. The two men talked for nearly 30 minutes, reminiscing about the battle 25 years before, letting their hot meal get cold. Other diners barely ate a thing, as they tried to listen in on the conversation between the two former Corps commanders. The next day, Longstreet and Sickles rode together in a carriage to the famous sites of the battle: Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Little Round Top, and the Cemetery Ridge, where Pickett's charge met its demise. Longstreet and former Union generals discussed strategy and tactics at length, along with attending ceremonies. A horseback ride with Daniel Butterfield, Hiram Berdan, and Sickles brought Longstreet to the top of Little Round Top. A group of Union veterans rushed to get a look at the former adversary. As they approached, Sickles said, "Boys, here's Longstreet, and he meets us once more on Round Top." The veterans gave Longstreet a cheer. At a platform where Union General Reynolds was killed, Longstreet was greeted with cheers and a band playing Dixie. He made a speech during which he broke down with tears. The whole occasion overwhelmed him with emotions. As he approached the podium, a former Union officer got up and declared, "Comrades, you see on this platform one of the hardest hitters who ever fought against us. I propose we give 3 times 3 for General Longstreet, one of the best Union men now in the country." The old general bowed and told the veterans how proud he was to commemorate the battle and, according to a newspaper report, to mingle with those brave men who know how to appreciate heroism, which will give up life for country's sake. But times have changed. 25 years have softened the usages of war. Those frowning heights have given over their savage tone, and our meetings for the exchange of blows and broken bones are left for more congenial days, for friendly greetings, and for covenant's tranquil repose. The ladies are here to grace the serene occasion and quicken the sentiment that draws us nearer together, he continued. God bless them and help that they may dispel the delusions that come between the people and make the land as blithe as bride at the coming of the bridegroom. During the reunion, a one-legged Union veteran approached Longstreet and said, "General, I fought against you at Round Top. I lost a wing there, but I am proud to meet you here." Longstreet grabbed his hand and said, "Yes, those were hot times then, but I'm all right now." On July 2nd, the crowd met at Cemetery Hill, the location where Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Longstreet, along with fellow Confederate General John B. Gordon and Dan Sickles, delivered speeches to the waiting crowd. Longstreet's was short. In it, he stated, "I changed my suit of gray for a suit of blue so many years ago that I have grown myself in my reconstructed suit of blue." That same day, Longstreet attended the 95th Pennsylvania's monument dedication in the wheat field. During the ceremony, Longstreet took the regiment's battle flag, pierced by 81 bullets during the war, pressed it against his lips, and began to weep. Newspapers reported between 30 and 70,000 people attended the grand reunion, and its ceremonies and dedications left an impactful mark on people who saw the veterans of both armies shaking hands and coming together on the battlefield. Just 25 years before, they had tried to kill one another on. When the reunion ended, Longstreet began his train ride back to Gainesville, 20 miles southwest of the Wilderness battlefield, where he received his most severe wound. The train broke through a rickety trestle, and part of it plunged through the now broken wood to the creek below. It was between 2 and 3 a.m., and Longstreet was sleeping in a sleeper car when the accident occurred. His car remained on the trestle. Longstreet extricated himself from the car and began to help others until it got daylight and others came to help. After escaping death, Longstreet continued on his journey to his farm in Gainesville. The year 1889 contained many disasters for the Longstreet family. On April 9th, Longstreet's farmhouse burned down, destroying its contents, including his uniform, sword, a sash given to him by Jeb Stuart, a pair of spurs that he had worn in both the Mexican War and the Civil War, and his library. On December 29th of that same year, Louise, his wife for over 40 years, passed away at the age of 62. One of Longstreet's biographers stated, "She had been James's wife for over 40 years and had borne 10 children, grieved deeply over the loss of 5 of them, endured the months of separation from her husband, waited alone in the silence and darkness of nights for reports of his safety, and followed him wherever duty or desire led him. From her childhood she had witnessed the sacrifices required of a soldier's wife, and when her time came, she chose a soldier." Longstreet buried her in Alta Vista Cemetery in Gainesville. As Longstreet grew older, his physical prowess that he used to its fullest in his younger days had given out. He wrote to one of his former aides that, "My arm is paralyzed. My voice that once could be heard all along the lines is gone. I can scarcely speak above a whisper. My hearing is very much impaired, and sometimes I feel as if I wish the end would come. But I have some misrepresentations of my battles that I wish to correct, so as to have my record correct before I die." In his last years, Longstreet attempted to correct his military record. Longstreet had granted an interview to an author writing a military history of the conflict in the East. In this 1865 interview, Longstreet criticized the aggressive actions at Gettysburg. 2 years after the death of Robert E. Lee, Jubal Early delivered a speech at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, where he criticized Longstreet and blamed him for the loss at Gettysburg, absolving Lee of his mistakes. Longstreet would launch a war to regain his reputation. Longstreet stated, "I believe that mistakes were made on both sides and that I am likely to be one of those who have committed them as anyone. But in order that the future students may have the benefit of our experience, I am more willing to have a thorough investigation of all military movements and operations, and their causes and effects." The old general wrote articles about the war for publications, but he would spend 5 years writing his memoirs, which was published in 1896, receiving great criticism and praise. Longstreet kept in touch with his former staff members. Tom Gorey remained in Texas but always helped to raise the spirits of Longstreet. In an 1875 letter, Gorey told Longstreet, "With my heart full of gratitude, I often think of you, and of your many acts of kindness shown me, and the innumerable marks of esteem and confidence bestowed upon me by you during the 4 long and trying years that we were together. Although we may differ in our political opinions, yet I have always given you credit for honesty and sincerity of purpose." Despite the attacks on Longstreet's character, he continued to visit battlefields for dedications. In 1895, he spoke at the dedication of the Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Battlefield Park. He was also present at the dedication of Grant's tomb and attended many reunions. At a monument to Senator Benjamin H. Hill in Atlanta in 1886, Longstreet was an honored guest, where he shook hands with former Confederate President Jefferson Davis amid loud cheers and rebel yells. Veterans of the 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia held a great love for their former commander, and it was their support of Longstreet that brought him happiness at these reunions. In September 1897, Longstreet would marry again, this time to a 34-year-old librarian named Helen. The two would move to Washington, D.C. when Longstreet became the United States Commissioner of Railroads. President William McKinley gave him that position because of his support during the campaign. The man who held the position before Longstreet was former Confederate cavalry commander Wade Hampton. Hampton was so mad at the loss of the position that he refused to help Longstreet during the transition. The position allowed him to travel extensively, particularly with Helen. They toured the Mexican War battlefields and explored the American West. In 1902, he and Porter Alexander attended the 100th anniversary celebration of West Point being established. It was during this trip that a great story emerged. While sitting on the front porch of his hotel, Longstreet spotted former cavalry commander Joseph Wheeler walking toward him in a blue uniform. Longstreet allegedly said, "Joe, I hope that Almighty God takes me before he does you, for I want to be within the gates of hell to hear Jubal Early cuss you in the blue uniform." In 1903, Longstreet was suffering horribly from rheumatism, severe deafness, and a cancerous eye. By January 1904, he caught pneumonia. On January 2nd, at his daughter's home in Gainesville, Longstreet began hemorrhaging, and a great gush of blood poured out of his mouth. His wife, his daughter, and 2 of his sons, Garland and Fitz Randolph, was by his side when he whispered to Helen at about 5 o'clock, "Helen, we shall be happier in this post," then passed away. The funeral took place on January 6th. One of Longstreet's men, whom he commanded in the war, presided over the funeral and delivered the eulogy. At a graveside service, a Confederate veteran laid part of his uniform on Longstreet's casket, along with his enlistment papers, and stepped back, paying respects to his former commander. He was laid to rest in Alta Vista Cemetery. Helen would outlive him by 58 years, passing away in 1962. Although Longstreet came under harsh criticism after the war, he filled his Civil War record with great military accomplishments. From his earliest actions at First Manassas to his last at Appomattox, he was a dependable commander, delivering hard-hitting assaults and superbly constructed defensive lines. When Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia, Longstreet became his most trusted advisor and would remain so until the end of the war. Other than his mistakes in Tennessee, Longstreet became one of the most successful Confederate commanders during the war, and even though some of his fellow commanders attacked him for his actions after the war, he remained resilient, defending his actions and attempting to set the record straight. Nevertheless, Longstreet will go down as one of the Confederacy's greatest soldiers.